Story 1.
My cheating wife believed her affair would strengthen our marriage, but I had a different plan. My wife Sherry believed I was unaware of her plans, thinking I was either foolish or oblivious to her growing affair with her CO worker Todd. She assumed I'd tolerate her actions and accept her continuing to be involved with him. However, she had another thing coming. She didn't realize I'd been suspicious for quite some time. I noticed clear signs of infidelity, like working late frequently, upgrading her wardrobe, more aggressive closeness, and a loss of interest in our shared interests. Despite my attempts to discuss my concerns, she consistently ignored them. Sherry naturally denied anything was wrong, attributing it to my insecurities and possessiveness. Working overtime, I had no choice but to hire a private investigator. I refused to remain blind to the truth. I'd made it clear from the beginning of our relationship and reiterated it over our 10-year marriage that I would never tolerate my wife cheating on me. So it was with mixed feelings that I sat in private investigator Jake Sloan's office and listened to his report. I felt relieved when he made it clear that Sher hadn't cheated. However, that relief was short-lived when he added the term "for now." As he explained, my wife was having an affair, it just hadn't escalated to something intimate, but it was only a matter of time. Apparently, Sherry and Todd referred to themselves as working spouses. I detested that term. Sher had only one spouse, me. Some might find that expression cute and harmless, but to me, it meant she was having an intimate relationship with someone else. Well, as it turns out, that's exactly what she was having. According to the private investigator's report, Sher and Todd had lunch together daily, just the two of them. They held hands and sat next to each other. He provided numerous photos of them hugging, sometimes even kissing. I was infuriated by what I saw and wanted to strangle that smug idiot Todd. In addition to lunches, the lovers often worked late together, even though there was no good reason for it. It was as if they wanted to avoid going home to their respective spouses and siphon as much of our time out of each day as possible. The detective told me that he was able to trace Sher's emails and messages. I knew this was completely illegal, and I could never use it in a divorce. In our state, divorce for infidelity was possible but difficult. No-fault divorces were much easier, and I didn't need evidence for that anyway. I just wanted it for my own purposes. Sloan refused to give me copies of the actual messages. He wouldn't even let me see them. Instead, he offered me a summary of what they contained. He assured me that my wife had never spoken disparagingly of me. Several times Todd tried to disparage me, but Sherry wouldn't let him. Well, I guess it could have been worse. Emails and texts confirmed their romantic relationship, although neither of them professed love. Their conversations were very intimate, bordering on sexting. Todd sent my wife pictures of his body, which she took delight in reciprocating with shots of her bare chest. As far as Sloan could tell, she hadn't sent any explicit pictures yet. As I sat in his office pondering my next steps, Sloan gave me the worst news of all. Todd's wife was going out of town for 3 days to visit her mother. The lovers decided to take the opportunity to meet up and consummate their relationship. The only thing standing in their way was me. They were uncertain about how they could spend the night together if I remained in the vicinity. Since I had no intention of leaving town, making it nearly impossible, they contemplated various plans. One idea was to inform me that Sherry was going on a girls-only weekend trip. Fearing I might discover the truth by talking to her friends, however, she didn't want to involve anyone to create a believable cover story, leading to the abandonment of that idea. Another option they considered was compelling me to leave town, but I dismissively remembered Sherry suggesting I organize a golf trip with my buddies, an option I rejected. Ultimately, they opted for a new but direct approach: honesty. Todd believed I was on the path to becoming a betrayed man and that I would do anything to keep Sherry as my loving, happy wife, even allowing her to have an affair. Somehow, he convinced Sherry that by sleeping with him, she would enhance our lovemaking life and relationship. He persuaded her that all she needed to do was disclose her plans with Todd to me, and I would reluctantly agree to let her proceed. Clearly, Todd underestimated my resolve. But what surprised me the most was that Sher bought into his deceptive narrative. It should have been evident to her that I wouldn't tolerate this. And if she failed to realize that, then she might be mentally unstable. Sloan informed me that this was all the information they had, so I accepted what he provided and went home. I requested him to continue monitoring Sher's messages and update me if anything changed. On Friday, Sloan called me and informed me that Sher planned to meet me the following Monday after work. She intended to disclose that she would go on a date with Todd on Friday night, starting with dinner and dancing and culminating with the couple spending the night in a hotel room. She would thoughtfully return to my house on Saturday or maybe Sunday, depending on their activities. Sherry and Todd rehearsed her entire speech, convincing themselves that I would acquiesce to her demands. They anticipated my initial upset and anger, but Sher planned to assure me that it was a one-time thing, despite both knowing otherwise. She even suggested having lovemaking with me afterward as a reward for my understanding, assuming I would be pleased to have Todd's sloppy seconds and comply with her wishes. How considerate of them to think of my needs. With only 2 days to prepare for the confrontation, Sher and Todd jokingly referred to it as an intervention. However, I was determined to turn their intervention into my stand. Over the weekend, I contemplated various scenarios, pondering whether I wanted to salvage my marriage. My plan of action evolved organically as I considered my feelings for Sherry. I decided to confront the issue directly and end it for good. Initially blissfully happy when we first got married, Sher and I spent all our time together, sharing everything we had experienced in life. She was my best friend and my best lover. But somehow it all seemed to disappear. Perhaps that's just the way things work. Nothing lasts forever. Maybe my view of marriage was old-fashioned and idealized, envisioning us as a team facing life's trials and tribulations together. Having experienced unsuccessful marriages before, Sher and I questioned whether the problem lay with us or the institution of marriage itself. How can people expect to maintain feelings, desires, interests, and passions when fate insists on being fickle and changing everything and everyone? In a world of fast-paced culture, social media, and instant gratification, perhaps marriage, like dinosaurs and CDs, is obsolete. Briefly considering the idea of letting Sher be with Todd, I quickly dismissed it, refusing to let him claim rights to my wife. I was ready for a fight. When my wife called me just after lunch on Monday, "Hey Sherry," I said, noting her recent lack of calls during my work hours. I expressed my concern about it and hoped everything was okay. She greeted me with a "Hi, honey," which made me wonder if she used the same endearment with Todd. Despite the thought, I brushed it off and inquired about her being home on time tonight, as she had something important to discuss. Responding positively, I mentioned having important news as well and confirmed my availability around 5:15. However, she didn't respond immediately, and I sensed her motive for asking. When she asked about the nature of my big news, I decided to keep it for our later face-to-face conversation. I excused myself, citing the urgency of my monthly report, and hung up. I then informed my boss about taking the rest of the day off, and he didn't mind. Sitting at the kitchen table later, I anxiously awaited her arrival. The garage door opened at 5:27, and despite my high emotions, I maintained a calm exterior. I had an open bottle of Sauvignon Blanc on ice and 2 glasses ready. She entered alone, tossing her keys and purse on the table, and I felt relieved she hadn't brought Todd along, which would have complicated things. I welcomed her with a smile. "Hi, sweetheart," I greeted her warmly, using the affectionate term she had employed earlier. I welcomed her home and asked whether she needed some time before our conversation or if she preferred to dive right in. My immediate desire to talk took her by surprise, and I could tell she wasn't prepared for it. So soon. My goal was to keep her in suspense and maintain the upper hand. Acknowledging her surprise at my readiness to talk, Sherry admitted she hadn't expected me to wait. Nevertheless, she agreed that starting our conversation sooner would be better, and joined me at the table. I proposed the idea of sharing my news first and inquired if she had any objections. Hesitantly, she responded, indicating that it was okay and expressing a slight uncertainty. Without waiting for her response, I poured us both a glass of wine. She accepted it gratefully, drinking half before I refilled her glass. Starting to discuss my thoughts on the matter, I conveyed that I had been reflecting on it a lot. I made it clear that I wouldn't beat around the bush and saw no point in dragging it out. Pausing deliberately to create tension, I observed Sherry stepping forward, her gaze fixed on me. Curious, she asked, "What's the matter?" I conveyed my desire for a divorce, stating it bluntly, and allowing a few moments for Sherry to grasp the message. Initially, confusion clouded her face, as if the words weren't registering. Eventually, understanding dawned, and she reacted with shock. Fear and anxiety briefly flickered across her expression, quickly replaced by surprise, perhaps stemming from concerns about her affair with Todd being exposed. In response to her query about the reason, I disclosed that my feelings had changed, expressing, "I don't love you anymore." My words appeared to affect Cher deeply. Struggling to comprehend my statement, she questioned, "You, what?" "I've fallen out of love with you, Sherry," I declared, sharing the fabricated detail that I couldn't recall the exact moment. In truth, I was well aware it had been a long time, but I had avoided confronting the reality. Perplexed, she asked, "What are you talking about?" Her expression hinted at an impending emotional breakdown, catching me off guard. In an attempt to illustrate my perspective, I prompted her to recall the early days of our marriage, reminiscing about our shared activities and routines. I highlighted the close bond we once had. Sherry nodded in agreement as I continued, mentioning our joint lunches, the anticipation of returning home to each other, and shared hobbies. Including the pottery classes she had persuaded me to join, her intense gaze indicated she was captivated by the memories. It wasn't about the pottery, it was about sharing the experience with you, she expressed. I loved every minute of it, watching you and assisting you. She admired my enthusiasm. Similarly, painting the Christmas village buildings became a shared activity we enjoyed. We purchased a dozen painted houses, creating a display for Christmas. It was a tedious task, but we found pleasure in it. Sherry admitted that mine were always better than hers. Recalling the nights spent at the table applying paint to the shingles, Sherry nodded in agreement. Back then, I loved her deeply. We also dedicated hours to painting large posters she had acquired during a trip to Myrtle Beach, long before adult coloring books became popular. Although we still had hundreds of coloring pens, they, like our love, had all dried up. When Sherry defensively asserted that her love hadn't dried up, I chose to ignore her and continued. Our friends often expressed jealousy over our relationship. We did everything together, taking long walks daily while holding hands. If I needed to run errands, such as going to the hardware store for grass trimmer line, she would accompany me. Similarly, if she wanted to shop for clothes, I would patiently wait outside the dressing room. Sherry challenged me, noting that I did enjoy accompanying her during shopping trips. I explained that I was often on my phone, not particularly interested in the clothes, but rather there to be with her. I emphasized that I didn't mind what she chose, finding her beautiful in everything. I mentioned that I could have stayed home watching sports but chose to be with her instead. We discussed how other women in the neighborhood gathered for activities like bingo or bachelorette parties. But Sherry never showed interest. Recalling her reason for not participating, I acknowledged her previous comment about preferring to hang out with me than with the chickens. Reflecting on our shared moments, we remembered cuddling under the covers on many nights, watching a favorite movie. Sherry, wiping a tear away, expressed her love for the film. I mentioned that we must have watched it at least 100 times and expressed a desire to continue watching it together. In response to my mention of divorce, Sherry exclaimed her reluctance to end the marriage. She envisioned growing old together, taking cooking and ballroom dancing lessons, or simply lying in bed and reading books. Expressing the growing estrangement between us, I admitted uncertainty about when it began. Looking intently into her eyes, I explained that we transitioned from dining out 2 or 3 days a week to a weekly occurrence, a change largely influenced by Sherry. She claimed a lack of time for lunch outside the office, which turned out to be untrue. She continued eating out, but with someone else. Eventually, we ceased having lunch together entirely, and I started joining my co-workers. I gradually found enjoyment in their company, perhaps even too much. In the conversation, I exaggerated the situation, making an effort not to place blame solely on Sherry. I wanted to avoid triggering defensiveness or turning the discussion into a scolding. It wasn't my goal, at least not yet. Our habit of coming home early to spend time together lost its significance. We began working later and later, and when we finally did return home, we often felt distant or distracted. Responding to Sher's question about why I never talked about it, I acknowledged that she was right. Despite having expressed these concerns many times before, I agreed with her, expressing a wish to understand why spending time together hadn't been important for her. I admitted feeling a sense of failure in that regard. I felt like I was taking responsibility for our estrangement. That was far from the truth. I knew that if I hit Sherry with Todd first, we couldn't end the discussion without it getting nasty. I would never make her see my side of things. I'd be the controlling, jealous idiot. Before I revealed what I knew, I wanted her to remember what we had and think about her role in destroying it. Gradually, we stopped doing almost everything together. You started going to your bachelorette parties. I started going to poker nights. You'd go to spas on the weekends. I'd go golfing. Sherry and I began to spend entire days without discussing anything beyond the weather or the latest news. Our lovemaking life also suffered, with fatigue or lack of interest often hindering our closeness. Reflecting on our early days of marriage, I pointed out how we couldn't get enough of each other. We used to engage in intimate activities 4 or 5 days a week, sometimes multiple times a day. I mentioned playfully fondling her while she cooked, skipping dinner to spend the night together. Activities like going to the hot tub, which used to be a regular part of our routine, had become non-existent for over a year. When Sherry suggested that I didn't want lovemaking anymore, I refuted the idea, finding it baseless. I believed she might be trying to shift blame onto me to justify her own behavior. In response, I laughed and clarified, "Oh God, no, I never stopped wanting lovemaking. I'm just as eager now as I was 10 years ago. I simply stopped wanting lovemaking with you." I knew that would hurt deeply. She thought she had rejected me physically, and here I was telling her that our lack of lovemaking was because I didn't want her. I almost would have laughed if I hadn't been so hurt. Sherry, taken aback, asked what I meant. When I mentioned she didn't want to have lovemaking with me, I casually mentioned losing interest and described how. From my perspective, she seemed unresponsive and disinterested in anything exciting or remotely naughty. I suggested that it appeared as though she wanted to finish quickly and move on to more interesting activities, like knitting. Expressing my desire for weekend lovemaking marathons, I emphasized that she didn't even want me to give her incredible pleasure. I labeled our physical encounters as boring and claimed that I had faked enjoyment in the last few instances just to get it over with. When Cher objected, claiming that I came inside her, I reminded her that she insisted on using contraceptives despite being on birth control. I explained that she never paid attention to the contraceptives, making it easy for me to fake it by humming, rolling off, and disposing of the empty contraceptive. Her reaction was one of shock and embarrassment, and I admitted that my plan had worked. Apologizing, I added insult to injury by suggesting, "It was me, not you." She stared at me for a moment, her face flushed, tears dried. I wasn't sure if her expression reflected anger, frustration, or embarrassment. In an attempt to ease the tension, I refilled her empty glass, and she took a big sip. Continuing, I explained that it was only a matter of time before we started seeking companionship elsewhere. I clarified that when I said someone else, I didn't mean myself, though she wasn't aware of that distinction. Suddenly, Cher asked angrily if I was cheating on her or in love with someone else. In response, I reassured her of my commitment to our marriage and emphasized my aversion to infidelity. I acknowledged our shared history of being betrayed by our previous spouses, expressing my dedication to not repeating those mistakes. Cher apologized, recognizing the unfair accusation and agreeing that she knew I wouldn't engage in such behavior. However, she looked guilty and couldn't meet my gaze, her hands trembling. Transitioning to the topic of our intimate relationship, I suggested waiting until after the divorce to be together for the first time, hinting at a new love interest. I then revealed my big news, stating that I had met with my lawyer and finalized the paperwork. I informed her that she would be served with divorce papers on Friday. In response to her desperate inquiry, I reiterated that she would indeed be served on Friday. Attempting to conceal a smile, I explained that it was for the best, allowing both of us to regain our freedom and acknowledge that the last 10 years had been a waste of our time. I expressed that the past years weren't a waste of time for me and suggested to Sherry that she likely desired the divorce as much as I did. I mentioned that it seemed she hadn't wanted to be with me for a long time, labeling our wedding as a mistake. Sherry objected, expressing her unwillingness to get a divorce. She insisted that she loved me and wanted to be married forever. Regrettably, I responded that I no longer loved her. Citing the no-fault divorce state we were in, I explained that splitting assets equally was the norm, and we could avoid a messy legal process unless one of us cheated and infidelity could be proven, which was unlikely in our case. I proposed dividing our money equally, planning to visit the bank the next day. I mentioned the need to open new accounts, get new credit cards, change utility bills, and sell the house, with a realtor scheduled to put it on the market on Wednesday. Sherry, feeling overwhelmed, objected, expressing uncertainty and asking me to stop. She cried again as I assured her that I had already packed my things and would be staying in a hotel until a permanent move. I suggested she stay in the house until it was sold. Sherry shouted for me to wait, but I insisted there was no need, emphasizing the urgency to handle everything before Friday. Confused, she demanded to know the significance of that particular day. I casually mentioned that Friday was the day she had planned a date with Todd, her boyfriend. I suggested it was the day they intended to spend the night in a hotel together for a passionate evening. Sherry froze, her eyes wide and mouth agape as she attempted to respond. I pulled out a folder containing a summary report from a private investigator. I showed her the section detailing her plans with Todd on Friday night. Interrupting her, I pointed out that the report confirmed their reservations at the Gaylord Texas for that night. When she started to explain, I cut her off, mockingly suggesting she might claim, "It's not what it looks like." I reminded her of the pictures capturing her and Todd kissing at lunch. Staring at me, tears streaming down her face, Sherry apologized quietly. With a wide smile on my face, I declared, "Now I remember exactly when I stopped loving you." I revealed that it was the day I discovered her plans to involve me in a betrayed man scenario, mirroring the betrayal from my ex-wife. She blurted out an apology, desperately trying to convince me that she didn't love Todd. According to her, the rendezvous with him was just a fling to rekindle our relationship. She assured me that after spending the night with Todd, we would spend the rest of the weekend having passionate lovemaking. She claimed Todd said it would turn me on and revitalize our sensuality. I countered, expressing my skepticism about revitalizing our lovemaking life by being with someone else instead of having it with me. I questioned the logic behind her actions. She attempted to change tactics, mentioning that Todd said I would be okay with it if it made her happy. I reiterated that I wanted her to be happy with me as we used to be, not with another man. I couldn't fathom how she thought I would be okay with such a proposition, given my clear stance against infidelity. She tried to justify her actions by claiming it wouldn't be infidelity since she would have my permission. Firmly, I stated that it would never happen. Realizing that I should have understood that from the beginning, I expressed my disbelief at how I could have allowed boredom and loneliness to lead me down this path. I admitted that Todd had sparked my interest again. In response to her questioning how I could be bored and lonely when we were happily in love, I acknowledged that I didn't know. She continued, suggesting that I might have felt that way because I cut us off, stopped having lunch with her, and avoided spending time together. She accused me of choosing to put myself in that position and spending time with Todd instead of her, creating a situation where both Todd and I were bored and lonely. She denied the accusation, insisting that she couldn't believe she would have intentionally distanced herself. She recounted how I had told her I was too busy for lunch, and on one occasion, I had even texted her to go without me. She believed it was my decision for us to stop having lunch, and I never mentioned it, which she thought indicated I didn't realize the change. Sherry expressed that I had been so absorbed in my world with Todd that I didn't notice I was losing her. She declared that she didn't want Todd, she wanted me and us to be the way we used to be. Apologizing, she admitted to screwing up and giving up on us. I insisted it was too late, shaking my head in disagreement. Sherry pleaded, promising to quit her job, work elsewhere, and never see Todd again. She professed her love for me and claimed she hadn't cheated because they didn't have lovemaking. She acknowledged her foolishness, stating that Todd meant nothing to her and begging me not to leave. I maintained that it wasn't that simple. Disagreeing when she said I stopped her before she went too far, I argued that just lovemaking would have sealed the deal. Sherry protested, saying they were just friends, and I countered, emphasizing that she should have been friends with me more than anyone else. Overwhelmed, Sherry dropped her head in her arms, sobbing, and vowed never to neglect me or take me for granted again. Sherry pleaded with me, asking if we could treat the situation as a big mistake and begging for forgiveness. I responded, stating that it wasn't just a mistake but a betrayal of our love. She insisted that her heart had always been mine and I was the one who was willing to give my body to another man. I reminded her that she stopped me and questioned if my love for her was so insignificant that I couldn't fight for it. Expressing that she meant everything to me and that I'd fight for her, Cher claimed she would die for me. I harshly declared my lack of affection, causing her to scream and attempt to pull me towards her. Despite her apologies and pleas, I asserted that while I believed she was sorry, it didn't change the fact that I no longer loved her. I assured her that she had Todd for comfort. Upon her revelation that Todd was married and only interested in a physical relationship, I grinned and suggested that his wife might have something to say about that. I informed her that both Todd's wife and I had used the same divorce attorney, handing her a folder containing the investigator's report, pictures of her with Todd, and details of the divorce proposal. I advised her to read the entire document. Sherry pleaded with me not to take such actions, suggesting that if I wanted to accompany her to the bank, I should call and let her know. I got up from the table and walked out of the house, ignoring the sound of my wife crying. Update: Sherry grappled with the divorce, and to avoid a prolonged and expensive legal battle. I agreed when the judge recommended marriage counseling. The counseling surpassed my expectations, fostering open and judgment-free communication between Sherry and me. She gained insight into why Todd's advances nearly jeopardized our marriage, and I conveyed the pain and humiliation she had caused. The counselor took pride in our progress. After a few sessions, I returned home, and we shared several passionate moments. Sherry willingly embraced my desires erotically. A year later, we had rekindled the loving connection we shared at the onset of our marriage. Sherry switched jobs and joined my company. We commuted together, had lunch daily not out of obligation but genuine desire. In fact, we did nearly everything together. We adorned a small Christmas tree, completed abandoned paintings, took up another ceramics class, and enrolled in ballroom dancing. To my surprise, a box of colored pens I found wasn't dry. One night, while cuddling under a blanket and watching You've Got Mail, Sherry kissed me and conveyed the need to discuss something important. Tears welled in her eyes, causing a moment of panic as my heart skipped a beat. Without giving me a chance to respond, Sherry revealed, "You're going to be a daddy." I smiled, wiped away her tears, and in a playful manner, mimicked Tom Hanks saying, "Don't cry, shop girl." So, I'm just obsessed with happy endings.
Story 2.
I discovered my wife was cheating on me when she had a baby that looked nothing like us. Recently, my wife and I celebrated our 6th wedding anniversary, and we have 2 amazing boys together. These wonderful kids are from my wife's previous relationship, and over time, we formed a strong bond as a family. Our weekends are full of happiness as we do fun things with the boys, like going to the movies and having dinners as a group. Being their stepfather brings me so much joy, and we always manage to have a great time together as a loving and unified family. About a year ago, our relationship hit a tough spot when my wife went out for a night with her friends. When she came back, I could tell that something was wrong. Worried, I asked her what was bothering her, but she said it was just tiredness from the night out. Even though I had a feeling there was more to it, I respected her space and didn't push further. Believing her explanation about being tired, I chose not to bring it up again. However, in the following days, I noticed that she was spending a lot of time on her phone, more than usual. Even during dinner, I asked her gently why she was texting so much. She told me she was chatting with her girlfriends about their recent night out and planning another one. While her answer seemed innocent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else might be going on. Back then, I didn't really pay much attention to her texting a lot with her girlfriends because it wasn't out of the ordinary. Looking back, I now realize that she might have been planning something with them that she wanted to keep private from me. Considering her busy job as a consultant at a big company, I didn't mind her sometimes going out with friends to relax and unwind. It seemed like a normal way for her to take a break, and I trusted her to have a good balance between work and personal life. Now my wife is enthusiastically talking about another girl's night out, which will be the second one in less than 3 weeks. While I understand her need to have fun and spend time with friends, there's a concern among the group she hangs out with. 4 of them are single, and she's the only one who's married. This situation makes me uneasy because she might have more at stake compared to her single friends. The other women she hangs out with are all single, and that makes me worried about potential risks. I want us to have trust and respect in our relationship, and I don't want to be controlling. The second girls' night happened, and afterward, I talked to her about my concerns in a gentle way. I stressed the importance of being careful and making sure that her single friends wouldn't influence her decisions about our marriage without her realizing it. Open communication and understanding are really important, and I want to be there for her while also making sure our commitment is protected. She looked confused when I told her about my worries, but she didn't say anything, seeming like she needed guidance. After work, I decided to visit my parents' house. I talked to my mom about how my wife keeps having these girls' night out gatherings, and I shared my concerns. I told my mom that all the women she hangs out with are single, and it worries me because they don't have the same responsibilities and commitments that my wife does. My mom listened to what I had to say and then told me, "I don't think there's anything wrong with girls' night out in general, but I understand why you're worried about her being the only married one in a group of single friends." My dad chimed in and said, "If I were in your position, I would speak up and let her know there should be some limits." Both of my parents stressed how important it is to talk openly and honestly with my wife about this, while also respecting her need to have fun with her friends. They advised me to communicate my feelings and boundaries effectively, so we can find a solution that works for both of us. My dad also pointed out that her going out so much without me is a big issue. Then my mom added that in their 40 years of marriage, she had only gone to 3 girls' night out events. She made a point that her girlfriends were married too, and they always made sure to be home by 11 p.m. After thinking about what my parents said on my way back home, I realized they were right. It was important to deal with this issue soon to prevent it from getting worse. When I got home, I talked to my wife about it, but she got upset and accused me of trying to control her and not trusting her. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to control her. I was concerned because I cared about her safety. Despite my explanations, she wouldn't listen and went to bed angry. The next day, she left for her girls' night out and didn't come back even after I got home from work. I was surprised because it was already the 3rd time this had happened, and I had no idea. She got home after 2 a.m., but I didn't talk to her right away. Instead, I stayed quiet and acted like I was asleep when she came into the bedroom. As I lay there, I realized I needed to understand why she was putting her outings with friends above spending time with our family. I decided that I should have an honest conversation with her to figure out what was making her want to leave her family and go out with her friends. Before going to work the next day, I contacted a friend of mine and asked if he still had the contact information for the private investigator he had hired before for his company. This was so I could give some background context. My friend had hired the investigator because one of his employees tried to get workman's compensation after an accident at work. The employee said he was too injured to come to work, which made my friend act quickly and get a private investigator. However, it turned out the employee was lying about his injuries. The investigator found out that during the time he was supposed to be recovering, the employee was playing golf and doing flag football. With this proof, the employee had to take back his compensation claim. After getting the investigator's contact details from my friend, I checked if everything was okay. I wasn't sure, so I told my friend about my concerns regarding my wife's recent actions. She had been going to these girls' night out parties a lot, and I was worried she might be involved in things she shouldn't be. My friend asked why I was suspicious of her loyalty. I explained that I had 3 instances where she went out and came back after midnight smelling like alcohol. Also, when I talked to her about it, she got angry and defensive, which made me even more worried. In reply, my friend said, Well, it looks like you have good reasons to worry. After that talk, I did something and called the private investigator. We set up a meeting for after work. During our talk, the investigator asked about my needs. I told him to watch my wife when she goes out with her friends to see what she's doing. When I met the investigator, he told me his fee was $100 per hour. I didn't care about the cost. I was focused on finding out what my wife was doing. I gave the investigator her picture and info about her car, job, and hours. He said he'd start watching her the next day. For those 3 days, I waited nervously for his call, curious about my wife's actions. Finally, he got in touch, and we set up a meeting after my work. He showed me some videos he had taken to reveal what he found. The video showed my wife leaving work in different clothes than she wore in the morning. It was clear she changed at work. The investigator followed her and saw her go to a bar. Inside, she joined a group of women who were her friends. They spent about 2 hours at the bar and then left together. The investigator kept following them to a nearby house, which was around 15 minutes away from the bar. When they reached the house, a man answered the door. My wife and her friends, all dressed in black, went inside with him. The private investigator said that wearing black helps him stay hidden during nighttime surveillance. He went to a window, keeping a little distance, and looked inside. He saw something that confirmed my fears. The girls were dancing closely with some guys, and sadly, my wife was among them. She was in a corner with a man who was acting inappropriately. He was touching her, and they were sharing a passionate kiss. After seeing this upsetting proof, the private investigator turned to me and said, "I think you now have enough evidence to take the necessary steps." He gave me a flash drive with the videos and mentioned that he would keep a copy just in case. After our meeting, I went back home feeling overwhelmed with emotions. Tears were streaming down my face. It was really hard to accept that my wife, whom I'd been married to for 9 years, had been unfaithful and was still doing it. I was torn about whether to show her the videos and confront her directly. For now, I decided not to show them to her. The next day, I woke up early and left for work without saying anything to my wife. While I was on my way to work, she texted me asking why I hadn't talked to her before leaving. Even though she messaged me, I didn't answer right away. When I got to work, I immediately called a few divorce lawyers to get advice on how to handle the situation and protect my interests. At the same time, I started looking for a place to stay because I knew I couldn't keep living in the same house as my wife. It was tough to think about leaving our home, especially considering my feelings for our boys, but I believed it was necessary given what my wife had done. I felt extremely devastated, as if my whole world had turned chaotic. I didn't know how to fix things anymore. Divorce seemed like the only real option. Trying to fix our broken marriage seemed pointless. It was clear that she wanted the freedom of being single, and I decided to let her have it. However, I had to approach this situation smartly, making sure our boys wouldn't be alone while their mother went out with her friends. Being in Massachusetts, I knew that divorce in this state was a no-fault process, which should make the legal side relatively straightforward. However, that night when I got home, my wife and boys were already there. When I walked in, my wife said hi and asked how my day was, and the boys happily greeted me with, "Hey, Dad." It was a really emotional moment, and I tried to hold back tears to stay composed. As the evening went on, everyone started getting ready for bed. After putting the boys to sleep, my wife came downstairs and invited me to watch a movie together. I said no, explaining that I wasn't in the mood. She understood and said, "All right, I'm heading to bed." Later, when she was asleep, I used that time to pack my things and prepare to leave. I waited until she was sleeping deeply before quietly leaving the house. Since I didn't have any other place to go, I went to my parents' house. Even though it was really late, my dad was genuinely worried about how I was doing and asked if I was all right. I wanted to be honest with him, so I sat down with him at the dining table, feeling really heavy-hearted. I showed my dad the videos that the private investigator had collected, revealing the evidence. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and his disbelief echoed the pain and shock I had been going through. My mom joined us downstairs, and I decided to show her the evidence too. The revelation left both of my parents without words, unable to grasp the sense of betrayal. I gathered the courage to let them know that I had decided to leave and start the process of getting a divorce. While they seemed sad, they didn't try to talk me out of it. After all, my choice was clear. Because of my wife's unfaithfulness, and I had reached a point where there was no going back. That night, I stayed at my parents' house to find comfort in their support during this tough time. The next morning, I woke up and sent a text to my boss, explaining that I'd be coming in late due to personal reasons. My boss was understanding and had no problem with it. While I managed my work matters, I saw a bunch of texts from my wife showing concern about where I was and why I had left the previous night. Despite all the messages, I didn't reply to any of them. I was still dealing with my emotions and needed space to process everything that had happened. Taking strong action, I looked for a divorce lawyer and started the legal process based on the fact that she had cheated. At the same time, I made the tough choice to move out of the house when I knew she wouldn't be there. I came back later to leave her a note. In the note, I explained that I had started the divorce process and gave her the necessary info. I also told her she could contact me at my parents' house if she needed anything during this chaotic time. When my workday ended, I went to my parents' house and saw my wife's car in the driveway. When I walked in, I found her at the kitchen table, tears running down her face. She asked why I had filed for divorce, and I gathered the courage to show her the videos on my phone. While I played the evidence, I calmly told her that I didn't deserve to be treated like this, and that her actions had shattered the trust between us. After a long and heartfelt talk, we both agreed that divorce was the best option. I told her I didn't want to keep the house since it was a rental property. So I suggested she could have it since she could handle the rent alone. The divorce process went smoothly, and the judge gave me 30 days to get my things from the house. I chose not to ask her alimony since I made more money. And child support wasn't needed as the kids were already getting it from their biological dad. We were both 33 years old, and the boys were 7 and 8. It was really sad because I'd grown to love those boys deeply, treating them like my own, even though I knew I wasn't their biological father. When my job offered me a chance in another state, I chose to take it to start a new phase of my life. I switched my phone number, only sharing it with my parents and a few close friends. Starting on this new journey, I've built a whole new life for myself. Almost a year has gone by, and I'm doing really well. I've embraced dating again, and emotionally I'm in a much better place. Moving and starting fresh has turned out to be a positive and transformative experience. My friends have told me that my ex-wife has been asking about me, and even tried to connect on social media. However, I have no interest in reconnecting with her or going back to the past. I'm satisfied with the choice I made to move forward in my life, and I encourage anyone in a similar situation to do the same. Although I still have tough moments, I'm learning to handle them one day at a time. Taking each day as it comes is how I'm dealing with the challenges that come up from time to time. Thank you for sticking with the story until the end, and if you enjoyed it, please show support by liking and subscribing to our channel. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. About a month ago, I discovered that both of my kids were the results of affairs my soon-to-be ex-wife had. For some time now, I've had a feeling that neither of them were really mine. 6 years back, when my son was born, I was incredibly happy. I had married my best friend, we had a child together, and everything seemed fantastic. But things changed as he got older. After a couple of years, I began to doubt if he was truly my child. He didn't resemble me. As he continued to grow, I noticed more and more how different he looked from what I would expect my child to look like. I'm not one to be small-minded or overly suspicious, so I didn't let that alone bother me. But it was my unfaithful wife's behavior that really raised my concerns. Whenever she went out, her whereabouts didn't match what she told me. She had big gaps in her schedule that she couldn't explain, prevented me from meeting anyone from her workplace. And a close friend of hers accused her of flirting with her. Back then, the situation worsened as her lies started catching up with her shortly after our son was born. However, I still loved her, foolish as it may sound. Whenever her lies unraveled, she'd assure me of her love for me. She managed to make me believe that even though she was deceitful and manipulative, she wasn't the type of deceitful and manipulative person I thought. Last year, she became pregnant again, and a small glimmer of hope clung to me that the child might be mine. Yet, when her daughter was born, it was clear she was of mixed race. I refused to sign the birth certificate, and the paternity test I insisted on confirmed my long-held suspicions. Neither of them are my children. That day, I initiated divorce proceedings and walked away from the family I had built. Knowing it would be devastating for her son to see me leave, despite my worries, I did my absolute best to be a good father to him. I cherished him deeply and gave my all to be the dad he deserved. But now, when I see him, a sense of revulsion fills me. I'm repulsed by my unfaithful wife, disgusted with myself for not trusting my gut feeling, and sickened by the idea that the past 6 years of my life were in vain. I've been labeled a monster by several people for leaving my son like this. Since I moved out, my ex has attempted multiple times to manipulate me into returning. She has him call me at odd hours of the night, sobbing and pleading for his daddy to come back. On the day I left, she paraded him into the room while I was packing, trying to show me the harm I'm causing. Whenever he's mentioned in conversations, whether online or offline, I'm subjected to criticism and humiliation. Even though I'm not the biological father of the boy, I am still his dad. Unfortunately, what I've come to realize now is that most people don't care about my own emotions. My parents are the only ones supporting me through all of this, as my own siblings criticize me for leaving a child behind, labeling me as a terrible person. My feelings of hurt and betrayal hold no value, all because there's a child involved. I understand it's not his fault. I know that the man he considered his father his whole life just walked away. But why am I expected to toughen up? Why must I pretend that everything is okay and hide my resentment for this whole situation? Why should I ignore my own life and feelings? I never truly was the boy's father, even though I loved him as one and still do. But if I had to continue playing that role, I would eventually come to despise him and resent him. I'd hate myself for not standing up and taking control of my own life again. He isn't my child, and even though it's not his fault, he's no longer my responsibility. Update? Well, this post really took off. Looks like sharing my personal problems achieved something. Anyhow, I've noticed a few common questions, so I'll just address them here. Her son knows the truth about why I left. I sat down with him and explained that I'm not his father, and that his mother deceived and cheated on me. I made sure he understood that I'm not angry at him, that none of this is his fault, and that I'll still think he's an incredible kid. Some people are suggesting that I never cared for him or was always seeking a way to escape. It's tough to convey feelings in a text post like this. And it's even harder to let intense anger toward your unfaithful wife distort the past 6 years of your life. However, you're free to believe whatever you want. I have a lawyer, and I won't be required to pay child support or alimony. Finally, for those who think I should remain a father figure in her son's life, that's not realistically feasible. I don't hold any hatred towards him, but I've been deceived, manipulated, and taken advantage of by a selfish and deceitful woman who has now entangled her children in her web of lies. He's an innocent victim of her actions, yet it can't alter the tough reality we're facing. I don't hold any grudge against him, it's just really sorrowful to think about how he must feel. However, whenever I look at him, all I can see is 6 years of deception I endured, 6 years during which I was manipulated and taken advantage of, and 6 long years of accumulating doubts and frustrations caused by a woman who used me. I can't set aside my bitterness to try and be a part of his life because the life I shared with him was nothing but a false front orchestrated by his mother. This is the tough truth I'm grappling with, and I honestly can't in good conscience subject myself or him to it any longer. Edit 2. I've noticed many armchair lawyers in the comments claiming this post is fake based on what I mentioned earlier. I won't disclose where I live, but I'm currently going through a legal process called disestablishment of paternity. It might not silence the 90% of you who think using Google makes you a lawyer, but at least I made an effort. Edit 3. This will be my final edit before I move on from this little diversion I created. First, I want to express gratitude to everyone for their kind words, both in the comments, DMs, and chats. You've brought some brightness into my day. After a while, I wish I could respond to all of you, but my gratitude knows no bounds. Next, I've observed a lot of people heavily criticizing the term I used to describe my soon-to-be ex. I want to clarify that I'm currently in one of the darkest periods of my life. My feelings are consumed by intense anger towards the woman who wrecked my life. Was my choice of words inappropriate? Is the term I used to depict her degrading and offensive? Yes, I admit that. But I won't apologize for it. What I'm sharing today is the reality of my current world. It's the uncensored flow of thoughts from an imperfect person. I don't aim to encourage hatred towards women or spread a message of misogyny, portraying women as terrible. That's not my intention here, nor is it the message of this post. Bob, and I'm currently 30 years old. I have red hair, and I'm in pretty decent shape. My job is in a factory working on a production line during the second shift. I've been doing this for 2 years. I don't have a fancy education. I graduated from high school but didn't go to college. I did spend 8 years in the Army as a heavy equipment operator. I had 2 tours overseas, one in Iran and one in Afghanistan. I didn't engage in combat, but I faced a lot of gunfire. After my 8 years in the service, I got married to my high school sweetheart 3 years ago. Initially, things were wonderful, but now it's turned into a living nightmare. I discovered that my wife has been having an affair throughout our time together. I've been attending school to become a truck driver. I'm aware that I have PTSD due to my time in the service, and I do see a psychologist for it, meeting with them 3 times a week. One evening, I wasn't feeling well and returned home from work earlier than usual. As I was about to unlock my apartment door, I overheard Rhonda laughing and chatting with some guy. They were making fun of me, saying hurtful things. My immediate impulse was to burst in and confront them aggressively, but I remembered a valuable lesson from my military days: never act in haste, especially when angry. I had to walk away and find a way to calm down. I was juggling night shifts at work, attending school during the day, and meeting my psychologist 3 times a week. The next day, I spoke to my psychologist about the situation. I admitted that I had seriously contemplated harming them, but instead, I decided to seek a way to get back at them and make them feel regret, all without landing myself in jail. He wanted me to see him every day, but I explained that I couldn't because of school, and that because of him, I hadn't dealt with them. I decided to take a week off and find out who this guy was and what to do. I bought 3 small spy cameras online that could record video and sound, activating when there was noise. Update 1, I kept an eye on my apartment to figure out who this guy was. He was coming over every night, which shows how foolish I was. I learned his name was John Rich. In the next 2 days, I got a new phone and a new phone number. Then I found an apartment in the next town over. I went to my landlords and canceled my lease for the end of the month. I went to my bank and changed my savings, checking, and credit cards. I canceled my auto and home insurance and got new insurance for myself at the new address. I contacted the utilities to change my account and to turn off the utilities at my old address by the end of the month. I talked to HR at my job to change my insurance to just cover me. Then I talked to the plant manager. I explained my situation and he was understanding, sharing that he had experienced something similar. He suggested I could be transferred to a different plant, but it would be a 3rd shift position. I agreed without mentioning that I'd be quitting in 2 months to start a new job as a truck driver. He inquired if I had a good lawyer yet, to which I replied that finding a lawyer was my next task. He shared his wife's lawyer's name, Mrs. Jenny Kurtz, mentioning that she's a fierce legal advocate. I expressed my gratitude and left. I called the lawyer's office to schedule an appointment for the following day. Later, I went to my friend Pete's house, asked for help with moving, enjoyed a beer, and he said he could arrange a truck and friends to assist. I told him I'd need them by the end of the month and promised to provide beer and pizza for the helpers, which he found agreeable. Update, over the past couple of days, I managed to accomplish a lot. Upon returning home, I found Rhonda asleep as usual. I obtained videos of Rhonda and John engaging in intimate activities in my bed, along with conversations where they insulted me. I noticed that John used my personal care products like shower gel, shampoo, mouthwash, and shaving cream. He even went so far as to put my toothbrush in the toilet, which Rhonda found amusing. I was furious and resolved to get back at them. The following afternoon, I informed Rhonda that I had some errands to run. I needed to keep my distance as being around her made me want to physically harm her. I had to act convincingly. I discovered where the jerk John worked. He's a used car salesman. I bought all new personal care items, shower gel, shampoo, mouthwash, toothbrush, and toothpaste. I also purchased a small gym bag to keep these things in. While in the shower, I urinated on my old items as payback. Revenge is satisfying. While observing John, I discovered he had multiple girlfriends. I trailed him and documented his interactions with various women, capturing photos of them kissing and hugging. The convenience of today's smartphones with their cameras, I have 2 more weeks to organize everything. Update, I visited the lawyer's office and explained the situation to her. I also gave her a flash drive containing the videos I had of Rhonda and John. Jenny watched some of the footage, feeling disgusted by John's actions with my toothbrush and how they both laughed about it. I informed her that I discovered he was also dating other married women. I had video evidence of him with them. I contacted the husbands of these women and arranged a meeting at a restaurant in 5 days without disclosing the purpose. I mentioned to Jenny that I might have more clients for her. After leaving the lawyer's office, I resumed tracking John. I learned that he was renting a motel room for his affairs. I bought 2 more spy cameras, disguised myself as a repairman, and persuaded the chambermaid Kelly to let me into the room by offering her $500. I explained my intentions to her, and she revealed that she had been through a divorce due to her husband's infidelity, wishing someone had helped her like I was helping the other husbands. I informed her that I'd need to return to remove the camera in a few days, and she agreed without hesitation. I positioned 1 camera inside aimed at the bed and arranged another outside the window to ensure the videos would be admissible in court. I discovered that one of the women John was involved with was his boss's wife. I made copies of all the videos on flash drives. I visited the doctor to undergo STD testing, and the results were negative. 5 days later on Monday, at the restaurant, all the husbands arrived without knowing the purpose of the meeting. My lawyer, Jenny, introduced herself and me. I provided each husband with a flash drive containing videos of their wives engaging in intimate activities with John, along with information about John himself. I informed them that I would be having my wife and John served on the upcoming Friday, which was the 30th. I also mentioned that Saturday marked the end of the month. I shared details of my preparations for divorce so they could consider similar actions. My lawyer, Jenny, inquired about my well-being and expressed gratitude for the new clients. All 5 of the other husbands also decided to have Jenny as their lawyer. Jenny asked what I had been doing regarding John and my toothbrush. I asked if she was genuinely interested in knowing. She confirmed, so I proceeded to share. I informed her that I had been urinating in the shower gel and shampoo. As for the toothpaste, she preferred not to hear about it and just chuckled. I provided her with new flash drives to assist with the other cases. I got in touch with Kelly, the chambermaid, to arrange the removal of the cameras. I also invited her to go out to dinner on Saturday, to which she agreed. I contacted Pete to confirm our plans for Friday afternoon, and he assured me there wouldn't be any issues. I've been avoiding Rhonda lately. We haven't been intimate since I discovered her infidelity. It seems she hasn't even noticed it. I surprised her by arranging an all-day spa appointment for Friday as an apology, and she was genuinely pleased. She informed John that she'd be occupied on Friday. His reaction wasn't mentioned. Update: I requested an additional day off for Friday. On that Friday morning, Rhonda seemed excited as she left for her appointment. I phoned Pete, and he arrived with some friends and a truck. Together, we got to work cleaning out my belongings. We managed to pack up all my stuff within 2 hours. When they went into the bathroom to retrieve some items, I cautioned them not to touch a certain area. Around this time, legal papers were served to Rhonda at the spa, and John was served at his now former job. All the wives were served with legal notices simultaneously. John was found in a beaten-up condition at his motel. Rhonda was furious when she returned home and realized I had disappeared. She also learned about John's infidelity. She had to move back in with her parents. Just as her lawyer believed he had located me at work, I had already begun my new job as a long-haul truck driver. My lawyer, Jenny, had the authority to manage my divorce proceedings on my behalf. Rhonda initially fought against the divorce but eventually gave up. 6 months later, I achieved my freedom. John now walks with a permanent limp and has lost his virility. For a period, it appeared that something new was breaking on him almost every other month, as if I could actually feel sorry for him. Yeah, right. It seems that all the cheating wives ended up getting divorced. One person brought about this outcome for everyone. Update: 5 years after our divorce, I was sitting in a restaurant when someone tapped me on the shoulder. It turned out to be Rhonda, but she appeared to have aged significantly. She inquired if she could join me for a brief conversation, and I gestured to the chair, inviting her to sit down. Rhonda's eyes welled up with tears as she apologized sincerely for the pain she had caused me. I was truly surprised by her words. I assured her that I had forgiven her long ago. She explained that she had married me because she wanted to escape from her parents. I asked if she'd like to have a meal with me, and she agreed. I called the waitress over and Rhonda placed her order. For the next 2 hours, we sat and talked. She informed me that she had gone back to school and become a nurse. In turn, I told her that I was still working as a long-haul truck driver, traveling across the country. Interestingly, whenever I stopped by in town, we would meet up and spend nights together in bed. This arrangement had evolved into a friends with benefits relationship.
Story 3.
The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of their suburban dream house, casting long shadows across the granite countertops. Jane stood before the coffee maker, watching the dark liquid drip into her favorite mug, her manicured fingers drumming against the marble surface. Success looked good on her. Everyone said so. At 42, she still turned heads at board meetings. Her dark hair always perfectly styled, her makeup precise. Her designer suits impeccable. The basement door creaked open behind her, that Jane's fingers stopped their rhythmic tapping. She didn't turn around, but she could feel David's presence, could sense his eyes on her back. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Early meeting. His voice carried that same flat tone it had held for months. Now, Jane lifted her coffee mug, using it as a shield. The Morrison account needs attention before the quarterly review. The lie rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. She'd repeated it so many times now. It almost felt like truth. David moved into her peripheral vision, heading for the coffee maker. His movements were mechanical, precise. Everything about him seemed measured these days. Gone was the man who used to wrap his arms around her waist while she made breakfast, who would nuzzle her neck and make them both late for work. This David was a stranger who shared her house and haunted their basement. You've been putting in a lot of hours on the Morrison account. He poured his coffee with surgical precision, not spilling a drop. Must be quite demanding. Something in his tone made her skin prickle. Jane turned to face him fully, studying his expression. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a fine layer of what looked like sawdust coated his shirt. Had he spent another night in the basement? All accounts are demanding at this level, she replied carefully. That's why I'm made executive vice president. Indeed, David's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but his eyes remained cold. Success requires sacrifice. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Jane busied herself with her phone, checking emails she'd already read, anything to avoid his penetrating gaze. When had their marriage become this minefield of careful words and hidden meanings? I should go. She gathered her things, laptop bag, portfolio, and beneath it all, the burner phone she'd bought 3 months ago. The device felt like it was burning through the leather of her bag. Don't wait up. This might be another late one. David was already turning toward the basement door, coffee in hand. Of course it will be. The click of her heels against the hardwood floor echoed through the house as she made her escape. Outside, the summer morning was already warming, promising another scorching day. Jane slid into her Mercedes, the leather seats cool against her skin. She sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the basement window of their house. A light flickered behind the glass. David, already back at whatever project consumed his time down there, her work phone chimed with a genuine meeting reminder. Board presentation at 9 a.m. But it was the burner phone that caught her attention as she pulled out of the driveway. Sam's message lit up the screen. Thinking of you. Lunch today. Jane's heart raced as she typed back one word, yes. The drive to her office building felt longer than usual, her mind wandering between David's strange behavior and Sam's waiting arms. She remembered the first time she met Sam at that business conference 4 months ago. He'd approached her after her keynote speech, all charm and intelligent questions about market trends. Their discussion had moved from the conference hall to the hotel bar, professional interest gradually giving way to something more personal. Your perspective on emerging markets is fascinating, he'd said, leaning closer than strictly necessary. But I'm more interested in your perspective on life. That night, nothing had happened beyond conversation. She'd mentioned her husband, shown her ring like a shield. Sam had respected the boundary then. But the seed was planted, and in the weeks that followed, it grew into something Jane couldn't control. The parking garage was nearly empty when she arrived at her office still early, just as she'd planned. Her heels clicked against concrete as she made her way to the elevator, the sound echoing off the walls. The same echo she heard in her too-quiet house. In her too-empty marriage, her office stood as a testament to her success. Corner suite, floor-to-ceiling windows, awards lining the walls. Jane set her bags down carefully, making sure the burner phone was hidden in her desk drawer. She had an hour before the board meeting, time to prepare, to focus on work instead. All the phone buzzed. Not the burner this time, but her home phone. David. Yes. She answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Found something interesting in the basement. His tone was conversational, almost light. Made me think of you. Jane's hand tightened on her desk edge. Oh, just some old photos. From when we first moved in. You used to come down here with me, remember? Help me organize things, plan projects. David, I have a meeting. Now you can't even stand to look at the door. A pause. Funny how things change. The line went dead before she could respond. Jane stared at her phone, her reflection warped in its dark screen. When had things started to shift? When had David's basement become forbidden territory? When had she started seeing it as an escape route rather than a prison? Her assistant knocked on the door, startling her from her thoughts. Board meeting in 15, Mrs. Clayton. Jane straightened her spine, pushed thoughts of David and basements and guilt aside. She had a presentation to deliver, a company to help run, a facade to maintain. She was good at facades now, better than she'd ever wanted to be. The board meeting passed in a blur of PowerPoint slides and profit projections. Jane performed flawlessly as always. Her colleagues nodded approvingly as she laid out her vision for the next quarter. If they noticed how her hands shook slightly when she reached for her water, they didn't mention it. Excellent work, as usual, the CEO commented as the room cleared out. The Morrison account is lucky to have you. Jane's smile felt brittle. Thank you, sir. If you'll excuse me, I have a lunch appointment. The hotel was 20 minutes from her office, in the opposite direction from her house. She'd chosen it carefully. No company clients, no friends who might recognize her car in the parking lot. Sam was waiting in their usual room. For 12, when she arrived, he opened the door before she could knock, pulling her inside with an eagerness that made her forget everything else. His kiss tasted like mint and possibility, his hands already working to remove her blazer. "I missed you," he whispered against her neck. "Sam, wait." Jane stepped back, though everything in her wanted to move closer. David's been acting strange lately. This morning, he called about finding old photos in the basement. The basement again. Sam's handsome face hardened slightly. That's all he cares about anymore, isn't it? His precious projects, his solitary kingdom underground. It's not that simple, isn't it? His fingers traced her collarbone, making her shiver. When was the last time he really looked at you? Really saw you? Jane closed her eyes, remembering David's cold gaze that morning. "We should be careful. We are careful." Sam pulled her close again. "He spends all his time in that basement. He doesn't see anything he doesn't want to see." But he did see, a voice in her head whispered. He saw everything, measured everything, calculated everything from his underground domain. The thought sent a chill down her spine, even as she surrendered to Sam's embrace hours later. Driving home, Jane rehearsed her cover story. Board meeting, client lunch, traffic on the highway. The lies had become a second language, one she spoke fluently now. But David's words from that morning echoed in her mind. Funny how things change. The house loomed before her, and even in the bright afternoon sun, the basement windows seemed to watch her approach with dark, knowing eyes. The basement door stood ajar when Jane entered the house, a sliver of light spilling onto the hallway floor. She paused, her keys still in hand, listening. The familiar sound of David's tools drifted up the stairs, a rhythmic scraping that made her think of fingernails on wood. "David?" Her voice seemed to disappear into the basement's depths. The scraping stopped. Footsteps approached, and David appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the light behind him. Something dark stained his workshop apron, paint or wood stain, she told herself, ignoring the way it gleamed wetly in the dim light. "You're home early," he said, his voice carrying that new edge she'd grown to dread. "Morrison account wrapped up?" "Not quite." Jane set her bags down carefully, conscious of the burner phone inside. "Just needed some files from home." David stepped fully into the hallway, and she noticed smudges on his hands, his forearms. He followed her gaze. "Messy project," he explained, though she hadn't asked. "Sometimes things get complicated when you're working in the dark." A chill ran through her despite the summer heat. "Maybe you should take a break. Come upstairs for a while." "Worried about me?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's new." Before she could respond, her burner phone vibrated in her bag. David's head tilted slightly, like a predator catching a distant sound. Jane forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral. "You should get that," he said softly. "Might be important." He turned and descended back into the basement, leaving Jane frozen in the hallway. The door remained open, an invitation or a threat. She wasn't sure which. In her home office, hands trembling, she checked the message from Sam. "Need to see you. Tonight." "Important." She glanced at the basement door, still open, still watching. "Can't tonight," she typed back. "Tomorrow." His response was immediate. "Can't wait. Need to talk about us. About the future." The word future made her stomach clench. What future? Her marriage was crumbling. Her husband spent his nights in a basement doing God knows what, and her lover was getting impatient. The perfect life she'd built was unraveling thread by thread. The basement door creaked, and Jane quickly tucked the phone away. David's footsteps echoed on the stairs, steady and deliberate. She busied herself with her laptop, pretending to work, as he appeared in her office doorway. "Found something else while organizing," he said, holding up a dusty photo album. "Remember this?" Jane's throat tightened. Their wedding album. David set it on her desk, opening to a page he'd clearly selected beforehand. There they were, younger and smiling, cutting their cake. Her in white, him in black, both looking at each other like they held the answers to everything. "We were happy then," David said, his finger tracing the edge of the photo. "Before the promotions, before the late nights, before the Morrison account." He emphasized the last words slightly, making them sound like what they were, a lie. "David, you know what else I found in the basement?" He closed the album with a sharp snap. Interesting how many things you can discover if you just take the time to look. Jane's heart pounded against her ribs. What are you talking about? But David was already walking away, the wedding album tucked under his arm. You should come down sometime, he called over his shoulder. See for yourself. That night, lying alone in their bed, Jane stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds from below. The scraping had started again, accompanied by occasional thuds that might have been footsteps or might have been something else entirely. The basement had become a living thing, breathing secrets up through the floorboards. Her phone lit up the darkness. Sam again. Please. Tomorrow. I can't do this anymore. Jane closed her eyes, remembering their last meeting. Sam's increasing frustration, his talk of leaving his job, starting fresh somewhere else. Together. As if it could be that simple. Okay, she replied. Tomorrow. Usual place. The next day passed in a blur of actual meetings and mounting anxiety. Every call, every email, every presentation felt like a performance in a play where she'd forgotten half her lines. By the time she reached the hotel, her nerves were frayed to breaking. Sam opened the door to room 412, but something was different. No eager embrace, no passionate kiss. He stood back, letting her enter, his face serious. We need to talk, he said, closing the door. Jane's stomach dropped. About what? I got a strange call today. Sam ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd never seen from him before. Someone knows, Jane. About us. The room seemed to tilt. What? Who? They didn't say. Just ask questions. About how long we've been meeting here. About whether I knew you were married. He paced the small room. They knew details, Jane. About things we've done, places we've been. That's impossible. But even as she said it, she thought of David's words. Interesting how many things you can discover if you just take the time to look. We need to end this, Sam said, stopping in front of her. Or we need to leave. Together. No more hiding, no more lies. Sam, I can't just... Why not? His voice rose slightly. What are you so afraid of? Your husband spends more time with his basement projects than with you. The marriage is over, Jane. It has been for months. You don't understand. Jane wrapped her arms around herself. David, he's been acting strange lately. The things he says, the way he watches me. Then leave him. Sam grabbed her shoulders gently. We could be happy, really happy. No more sneaking around. No more burner phones, no more lies. Jane stepped back, her mind racing. I need time. Time. Sam laughed bitterly. That's all we've had, Jane. Time to hide. Time to lie. Time to pretend this is enough. Well, it's not enough anymore. Not for me. Please, just let me think. Fine. Sam's jaw clenched. Think about it, but don't take too long. Some opportunities don't last forever. The drive home was a blur of tears and terror. Someone knew. Someone had called Sam. And in her heart, she knew who that someone was. The basement light was on when she pulled into the driveway, as always. David's car wasn't there, but that meant nothing. He could have walked, could be watching from somewhere, could be... She needed to think, needed to clear her head. Without conscious decision, she found herself moving toward the basement door. David always retreated. There maybe answers waited below. The handle turned easily under her hand. The stairs creaked as she descended, each step bringing her closer to whatever truth David had been guarding. The basement light cast strange shadows. Tools lined the walls. Projects in various stages of completion cluttered the workbenches. And there, in the center of the floor, Jane's world, tilted on its axis, Sam's body lay sprawled on the concrete, a pool of blood spreading beneath him like a grotesque halo. His eyes stared sightlessly upward, accusing in death as they had never been in life. That a scream built in her throat, but shock held it captive. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone, her real phone this time, and dialed David's number. That he answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. Yes. David, she managed, her voice shaking. David, Sam. I found. Stay there, he said, his voice eerily calm. I'll be home soon. The line went dead. Jane stood frozen, staring at Sam's body, her lover's blood soaking into the concrete of her husband's domain. Every secret rendezvous, every stolen kiss, Every lie she'd told played through her mind like a macabre slideshow. The basement light hummed above her, constant and accusing, as she waited for David to return, knowing with terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. 3 weeks earlier, the cracks in Jane's perfect life had begun to show more clearly. She sat in her office, staring at an email from Sam, his work email this time, perfectly innocent on the surface. Meeting to discuss Q3 projections? The time and date corresponded to their usual hotel rendezvous. A knock at her door made her close the email quickly. Her assistant entered with a stack of reports. "These need your signature, Mrs. Clayton. And your husband called, said he couldn't reach your cell." Jane's hand instinctively went to her purse, where the burner phone lay hidden. She turned it off during her morning meeting and forgotten to switch it back on. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll call him back." But when she did, David didn't answer. Instead, she got a text message. "Found something interesting in one of your old boxes. Come see when you're home." The words sent a chill through her. She'd been meaning to clean out those boxes for months, had even started one weekend before David's increasing basement obsession had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. What could he have found? That evening, she arrived home earlier than usual, her heels clicking against the hardwood as she approached the basement door. It stood open, warm light spilling up the stairs along with the sound of classical music. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, David's favorite. "David?" She called down, one hand on the railing. The music stopped abruptly. "Come down." His voice drifted up. "I want to show you something." Each step down felt like a descent into another world. The basement had changed since she'd last ventured down here months ago. David's workbenches had multiplied, creating a maze of half-finished projects. Tools hung on the walls in perfect alignment, their shadows stretching like reaching fingers. David stood at his main workbench, his back to her. "Remember when we first moved in?" He didn't turn around. "You used to love coming down here, watching me work, planning our future." "David, what did you want to show me?" He turned then, holding something in his hands. A small wooden box, one she recognized with a jolt of fear. Her jewelry box, the one she kept in her closet. "Found this while organizing," he said, opening it slowly. "Interesting collection you have now. Some pieces I don't remember giving you." Jane's throat went dry. The silver bracelet Sam had given her last month, she'd hidden it in there, telling herself David never looked through her things. "I've been doing a lot of thinking down here," David continued, closing the box with a sharp snap. "About changes, about patterns, about how people can live together for years and still keep secrets." He set the box down with precise movements. "Would you like to know what else I've discovered?" "I have work to finish," Jane managed, already backing toward the stairs. "Reports to review." "The Morrison account?" His smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course. Don't let me keep you from your priorities." She fled up the stairs, her heart pounding. In her home office, she pulled out the burner phone with trembling hands. Sam answered on the first ring. "We need to talk," she said. "Something's wrong." "David, come over," Sam interrupted. "Not the hotel. My place. We need to figure this out." She'd never been to his apartment before. It had seemed too risky. But now, with David's words echoing in her head and the memory of that knowing smile, anywhere seemed safer than her own house. That Sam's apartment was exactly as she'd imagined. Modern, minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He poured her a glass of wine as she paced his living room, recounting the scene in the basement. "He knows," she finished, her voice shaking. "He has to know? Then what are we waiting for?" Sam set his glass down hard enough to slosh wine onto his pristine coffee table. "Let's leave. Tonight. I have savings, connections in other cities. We could start fresh." "It's not that simple." "It is that simple." He grabbed her hands, pulling her close. "Look at me, Jane. Really look. What are you holding on to? A marriage that's dead? A husband who spends his time lurking in a basement, playing mind games?" She pulled away, moving to the window. The city lights blurred through her tears. "You don't understand. The way he's been acting, it's like he's waiting for something, planning something. All the more reason to leave." Sam came up behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I love you, Jane. I want a real life with you. No more hiding, no more secrets." The words hit her like a physical blow. Love. They'd never said it before, had kept their affair in the safe territory of passion and escape. Love made it real. Love made it dangerous. "I need time," she whispered. "Time?" His hands tightened slightly. "How much more time, Jane? While your husband plays his basement games? While we sneak around like teenagers? I'm tired of sharing you with a ghost. Please." She turned to face him. "Just let me handle this my way. I need to be careful." Sam's face hardened. "Careful. Right. Because that's worked so well so far." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "You know what? Take all the time you need. But don't expect me to wait forever." The drive home was a blur of tears and recriminations. The house was dark when she arrived, except for the eternal basement light. She sat in her car, watching that rectangle of illumination like a beacon of doom. Movement caught her eye, a shadow passing behind the basement window. Was David watching her? Had he seen her car pull up? Had he somehow followed her to Sam's? The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia. Every creak from the basement made her jump. Every time David emerged, she studied his face for signs, his words for hidden meanings. He seemed almost amused by her tension, taking his time with conversations that used to be brief, lingering in doorways just a moment too long. To Sam's messages grew more insistent, then angry, then pleading. "We need to talk," his last text read. "This can't go on. Come to the house tonight. Please." She didn't respond, couldn't respond. David had been watching her too closely, appearing suddenly whenever she reached for her phone, asking casual questions that felt like traps. That final morning, everything felt wrong. The house was too quiet, the basement door closed for the first time in weeks. No sound of David's tools, no music drifting up the stairs. Just silence, heavy with anticipation. When she arrived home that evening, the basement door stood open again. No David, no sounds, just that eternal light spilling up the stairs. Something pulled her forward. Curiosity, fear, fate. The stairs creaked under her feet as she descended. The basement air felt thick, charged with something she couldn't name. Tools lined the walls as always, but something was different. The workbenches had been moved, creating a clear path to the center of the room, and there, on the concrete floor, lay Sam. His eyes stared upward, unseeing, accusing. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the concrete like a final signature on their affair. Jane's world narrowed to that single image. With numb fingers, she pulled out her phone, her real phone, and dialed David's number, that he answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "Yes, David." Her voice sounded strange in her ears. "David, Sam. I found." "Stay there," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I'll be home soon." The line went dead, leaving Jane alone with her dead lover and the humming basement light. Every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, every lie she'd told played through her mind like a macabre slideshow. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, as the basement light buzzed above her like an accusation. Her perfect life lay shattered on the concrete floor, and somewhere in the city, David was coming home, coming to show her exactly what he'd discovered during all those hours in his underground domain. Jane's legs gave out. She sank to her knees on the cold basement floor, her eyes fixed on Sam's lifeless form. The concrete seemed to pulse beneath her, each heartbeat drawing more blood from his body into the thirsty ground. The basement light buzzed overhead, a steady drone that matched the ringing in her ears, the crunch of tires on gravel cut through her days. Car door. Footsteps. The front door opening and closing with deliberate slowness. David's measured steps across the floor above, each one bringing him closer to the basement door. She should run. Should call the police. Should do something besides kneel here, watching her lover's blood seep into her husband's domain. But her body refused to move, refused to do anything but bear witness to the nightmare before her. David's footsteps descended the stairs, each creak a countdown to confrontation. He appeared in her peripheral vision, but she couldn't tear her eyes from Sam's face. "Oh," David said, his voice carrying that same eerie calm from the phone. "I see you found him." The casual tone snapped something in Jane. She whirled to face him. "Found him? Found him? He's dead, David. Sam is dead in our basement." "Sam?" David tilted his head slightly. "Is that what you called him?" Interesting. I've been thinking of him as the man who's been fucking my wife for the past few months. The crude words, so unlike David's usual measured speech, hit Jane like a slap. How long have you known? Known? He moved to stand beside her, looking down at Sam's body with clinical detachment. I suspected when you started working late on the Morrison account. Confirmed it when I followed you to the hotel 3 months ago. Room 412. He smiled thinly. You should have been more careful with the receipts in your purse. Jane's mind raced through every meeting, every careful plan. You've been watching me all this time? Watching, learning, planning. David circled Sam's body slowly. It's amazing what you notice when you really pay attention. The way you checked your phone under the table. The extra makeup in your car. The silver bracelet he gave you. The one you thought you'd hidden so cleverly. David, Jane's voice shook. What did you do? He stopped circling, standing directly across from her with Sam's body between them. Me? I didn't do anything. You're the one who found him here, remember? In my basement, where you never come anymore. Except tonight, for some reason, you did. His eyes glittered in the fluorescent light. Why was that, Jane? Before she could answer, heavy footsteps sounded above. David's expression didn't change. That would be the police, he said calmly. I called them on my way home. Thought they should know my wife found a dead man in our basement. You what? Panic clawed at Jane's throat. David, please. Mrs. Clayton? A voice called down the stairs. This is Detective Morris. Could you come up here, please? David gestured toward the stairs with exaggerated courtesy. After you, dear. Jane's legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs. 2 police officers waited in her pristine living room. A tall man with graying hair and a younger woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Clayton, the male detective began. I'm Detective Morris. This is Detective Rodriguez. Your husband called about a body in your basement? Aye. Jane looked back at David, who had followed her up. His face was a mask of concern now, all traces of menace carefully hidden. Yes, I found him when I got home. And you know the deceased? Detective Rodriguez's pen hovered over her notepad. His name is Sam Maxwell, Jane managed. He was a business associate. Just a business associate? David's voice carried just the right note of confusion. Darling, shouldn't you tell them about the affair? The words hung in the air like poison. Jane watched the detectives exchange glances, saw the subtle shift in their posture. In one sentence, David had transformed her from grieving discoverer to prime suspect. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at the station, Detective Morris suggested. It wasn't really a suggestion. Of course, David stepped forward, all helpful concern. Should I come with you, dear? For support? The look in his eyes made his true meaning clear. To watch her squirm, to see her unravel thread by thread. That won't be necessary, Mr. Clayton, Detective Rodriguez interjected. We'll need to speak with both of you separately. The next hours passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and sterile rooms. Jane sat in an interview room, watching her perfect life crumble under the detective's questions. How long was the affair going on? Detective Morris asked, his tone carefully neutral. For months. No point in lying now. It started at a business conference. And when did your husband find out? Jane's laugh held an edge of hysteria. Apparently, he knew all along. He was watching us, following us. That must have made you angry, Detective Rodriguez suggested. Finding out he knew, that he was playing with you, Jane stopped, seeing the trap. I didn't kill Sam. I found him like that. In the basement. The basement you never visit anymore, according to your husband. Morris consulted his notes. Yet tonight you went down there. Why? How could she explain the pull she'd felt? The strange compulsion to descend those stairs. Something felt wrong. David had been acting strange. Strange how? Leaving the door open. Making comments about things he'd found. Playing music. She trailed off, hearing how it sounded. He knew about Sam and me. He was watching us. Planning something? Planning what, Mrs. Clayton? Rodriguez leaned forward. Are you suggesting your husband killed Mr. Maxwell? I don't know. Jane buried her face in her hands. I don't know what happened. I just found him there, bleeding out on the concrete, and David was so calm. Like he expected it. Your husband says he was at work all day, Morris noted. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. Where were you this afternoon, Mrs. Clayton? The question hit her like ice water. Her last meeting with Sam, his ultimatum, his insistence that they leave together. How much of that did David know? Had he orchestrated everything, pushed Sam to force her hand? I was at work too, she said finally. You can check with my assistant. We will. Rodriguez's pen scratched across her notepad. We'll also need to check your phone records, emails, security footage from the hotel. Jane's head snapped up. The hotel. Room 412, Morris supplied. Your husband mentioned it. Said he found receipts. Of course he had. David had mentioned that specifically, planted that seed in their minds. What else had he told them while she sat here, walking into every trap he'd laid? I want a lawyer, she whispered. Morris nodded, unsurprised. That's probably wise. We'll need you to stay in town, Mrs. Clayton. Don't make any travel plans. As if she could run. As if David hadn't already ensured she was thoroughly tangled in his web, the drive home was silent. David at the wheel, since the police had kept her too long for her to drive legally. He hadn't been charged with anything, of course not. He had alibis, witnesses, a perfect performance as the concerned husband. You should get some rest, he said as they pulled into the driveway. It's been a long night. Jane stared at the basement window, still lit despite everything that had happened down there. How did you do it? Do what? His voice was gentle, reasonable. Find out about the affair? Accept that my wife was sleeping with another man? Plan my response? He killed the engine, plunging them into darkness. One day at a time, Jane. One betrayal at a time. Sam didn't deserve to die. David's laugh was soft and terrible. Maybe not, but you didn't deserve my trust either, did you? Actions have consequences. You taught me that. He got out of the car, leaving her alone with those words and the steady light from the basement. Watching, always watching, the lawyer's office smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Jane sat rigid in a high-back chair, while Mr. Harrison, a silver-haired man with kind eyes and an expensive suit, reviewed the police reports. They're building a circumstantial case, he said finally, setting down the papers. Your fingerprints in the basement. It's my house, Jane interrupted. Of course my fingerprints are there. On the murder weapon? Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. A wrench from your husband's toolbox, covered in both your prints and the victim's blood. Jane's stomach lurched. That's impossible. I never touched it. She stopped, remembering. 2 weeks ago, David asked me to bring him tools while he worked. Said he missed my company in the basement. And you didn't find that strange? Everything was strange by then. Jane pressed her fingers to her temples. He was always watching, always making comments about things he'd found, about changes and patterns. Mrs. Clayton, Harrison leaned forward. I need you to be completely honest with me. Did your husband ever threaten you directly? No. David doesn't threaten. He suggests, implies. She met the lawyer's eyes. The day before I found Sam, David called me about finding old photos in the basement. When I went down to look, he showed me my jewelry box instead, with the bracelet Sam gave me inside. Harrison made a note. And Mr. Maxwell's death occurred the next day? Yes. After he called me, demanded to meet, said someone had contacted him, knew about us. Jane's voice broke. It was David. It had to be David. He orchestrated everything. That would make a compelling story, Harrison agreed, if we had any evidence. But your husband has alibis for the entire day. Multiple witnesses place him at work until just before he received your call. He planned it that way. Mrs. Clayton, Harrison's voice remained steady. The police have security footage of you entering the hotel with Mr. Maxwell numerous times. They have phone records showing calls between you two at all hours. They have financial records showing large cash withdrawals from your account that coincide with hotel visits. David told them where to look, Jane whispered. He's been planning this for months. Perhaps. Harrison closed his folder. But what we need is proof. Without it, all we have is a jealous wife who got caught in an affair and, according to the prosecution's theory, killed her lover in a rage. Jane stood abruptly, pacing the office. This is insane. I need to talk to David. Make him understand. That would be unwise. Harrison's tone hardened. Your husband is not your ally in this, Mrs. Clayton. Every conversation you have with him could be used against you. But Jane was already reaching for her phone, dialing their home number. David answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, his voice warm with false concern. "How was your meeting with the lawyer?" "You have to tell them the truth, David." Jane struggled to keep her voice steady. "About following us, about the jewelry box, about all of it." The truth. She could hear something in the background. That damn classical music he always played in the basement. "The truth is, I found out my wife was having an affair. I was hurt, angry, but I wanted to work through it. Then she killed her lover in my basement. That's the truth. I told the police." "You're lying." "Am I?" The music grew louder. "Tell me, Jane, why did you go down to the basement that day? What were you looking for?" I felt something was wrong." "Wrong how? Because I knew about the affair? Because I'd been watching? Or because you'd already put him there yourself, and you needed to make sure—" "Stop it." Jane's hand clenched around the phone. "You did this. You planned everything. Prove it." David's voice turned silky. "Prove any of it. Show them one piece of evidence that I did anything except love my wife and trust her too much." The line went dead. Jane turned to find Harrison watching her with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what you cannot do again. Every word you speak to him is another nail in your coffin." Later that afternoon, Jane sat across from Detective Rodriguez in another sterile interview room. Her new lawyer had advised against it, but Jane insisted. She needed them to understand. "Walk me through the day again," Rodriguez said, her pen poised. "You went to meet Mr. Maxwell at his apartment," Jane supplied. "Not the hotel this time. He said someone had called him, knew about us. He wanted to leave town together. And you refused?" "I said I needed time." Jane's voice caught. He was angry. Said he was tired of waiting, tired of sharing me with a ghost. Rodriguez made a note. "Did you tell your husband about this meeting?" "No, but—" Jane hesitated. "He knew. Somehow. He always knew everything. Because he was following you?" "Yes." "He admitted it that night. Said he'd known for months, had been watching us planning." She stopped, seeing the skepticism in Rodriguez's eyes. "You don't believe me." "Mrs. Clayton," Rodriguez set down her pen, "we've interviewed your husband extensively. He's cooperated fully, provided alibis, expressed genuine shock and grief at the situation. You, on the other hand, have changed your story several times." "I haven't changed anything. I'm trying to make you understand." "Understand what?" "That your husband orchestrated an elaborate plot to frame you for murder, despite having no criminal record and an ironclad alibi, while you were the one with means, motive, and opportunity." Jane slumped in her chair. "Have you searched the basement thoroughly? There must be something. We found plenty." Rodriguez opened a folder. "Your fingerprints on the murder weapon. Traces of Mr. Maxwell's blood on clothes in your home office trash. A burner phone with messages discussing marriage troubles and plans to leave town. Those messages were to Sam, about leaving David. So you admit you were planning to leave?" Jane saw the trap too late. Every word she spoke dug her deeper into David's carefully constructed narrative. She could almost hear his voice. "One day at a time, Jane. One betrayal at a time." That evening, she sat in their empty house, unable to sleep. David had offered to stay at a hotel. "To give you space, dear. I know this must be difficult." His consideration fooled everyone except her. The basement light still burned, visible through the kitchen window. Jane found herself drawn to it, moving down the stairs almost against her will. The blood had been cleaned away, the concrete scrubbed pristine, but she could still see the outline where Sam's body had lain. Her phone buzzed. Detective Morris. "Mrs. Clayton, we've finished processing Mr. Maxwell's apartment. We found something interesting in his safe. Care to explain why he had divorce papers drawn up in your name?" The room spun. Jane grabbed the railing for support. "What?" "Preliminary papers, dated 3 days ago, along with plane tickets to Mexico. 2 of them. I didn't—" But she remembered Sam's words. "Let's leave. Tonight. I have savings, connections in other cities." "There's more," Morris continued. "Bank records show a large transfer from his account to an offshore holding company. The same day you withdrew $10,000 in cash." Jane sank to the basement floor, the concrete cold against her legs. "That's not—" "I never. We'll need you to come back in tomorrow." Morris's voice was professionally neutral. Bring your lawyer. The line went dead, leaving Jane alone in the basement that had become her husband's masterpiece. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every coincidence had been carefully crafted to tell one story, her story. Written in David's perfect, poisonous script, her phone buzzed again. A text from David, coming home soon. Don't wait up. And Jane? Be careful in the basement. Concrete gets slippery when it's been cleaned. She could almost hear the classical music playing, see his slight smile as he typed the words. The basement light hummed overhead, watching, always watching, as David's web drew tighter with every passing hour. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Detective Morris's face as he laid out the photos. Jane stared at them, her lawyer's presence beside her doing nothing to stop the room from spinning. These were taken 2 days before Mr. Maxwell's death, Morris said, tapping one image. It showed Jane and Sam outside his apartment building. Notice anything interesting about your hands? Jane leaned closer. In the photo, she was carrying something, a gym bag. I never. Don't answer that, Harrison interrupted. Detective, if you have questions, ask them directly. Morris spread out more photos. Jane and Sam entering his building. Jane leaving alone without the bag. We found traces of blood in Mr. Maxwell's apartment. On the bathroom floor, specifically. Like someone cleaned up there before moving the body. This is ridiculous. Jane's voice shook. I didn't kill Sam. David orchestrated this whole thing. He followed us. He knew about the hotel. Mrs. Clayton, Rodriguez, cut in from her position by the door. We've been through your husband's movements that day. He was in meetings from 9 to 4, then at a client dinner until he received your call. Dozens of witnesses confirm this. Because he planned it that way. Jane stood abruptly, causing Harrison to place a warning hand on her arm. Don't you see? He's been planning this for months. The comments about the basement, the way he watched me, the things he said, Morris repeated slowly. Like when he confronted you about the affair? He never confronted me. That was part of his game. He just hinted, made comments, left the basement door open. Rodriguez stepped forward. Mrs. Clayton, we spoke with your assistant. She said you've been increasingly paranoid over the past month, making comments about being watched, checking over your shoulder, asking her to sweep your office for listening devices. Jane sank back into her chair. Because David was watching me. He admitted it. After you killed your lover? Morris's voice hardened. Convenient timing. I want to speak to my husband. Jane, Harrison warned. That's not advisable. No. She stood again, steadier this time. I want to speak to David. Now. Here. With cameras running and witnesses present. The detectives exchanged glances. Finally, Morris nodded. I'll make the call. David arrived 30 minutes later, pristinely dressed in a charcoal suit. He entered the interview room with measured steps, his face a perfect mask of concern. Jane, he said softly, you wanted to see me? Tell them, she demanded. Tell them how you followed us to the hotel. How you found Sam's bracelet in my jewelry box. How you spent months planning this in that basement of yours. David sat across from her, his movements careful, controlled. Is that what you believe happened? It's what had happened. You admitted it that night, said you'd known for months, been watching us. Jane, his voice carried infinite patience. I admitted to discovering your affair, yes. I was hurt, angry, but I wanted to work through it. Then you. He paused, his expression pained. Then you killed him in our basement. Stop lying. Jane slammed her hands on the table. You orchestrated everything. The photos, the evidence, all of it. The evidence? David glanced at the detectives. You mean the bloody clothes in your office? The wrench with your fingerprints? The security footage and hotel receipts? He shook his head sadly. I didn't orchestrate any of that, Jane. You did. Every choice, every lie, every secret meeting, those were all you. The divorce papers in Sam's safe, Jane countered. The plane tickets, you planted those. Actually, David's voice softened further. I didn't know about those until the police told me. Were you really planning to leave me, Jane? After 20 years of marriage? The gentle hurt in his tone made her want to scream. This was what he did. Turned everything around. Made her doubt her own memories, her own reality. What about the basement, she tried. The music, the tools, the way you kept going down there. I restore furniture, Jane. You know this. It's been my hobby for years. He smiled sadly at the detectives. She used to help me before. Well, before everything changed. The blood, Jane whispered. On your hands that morning would stain? David held up his hands, showing faint red-brown stains around his nails. I was refinishing a mahogany table. Would you like to see it? It's still in the basement. Jane stared at him, seeing what everyone else saw. The patient, devoted husband trying to understand his wife's unraveling. Every word he spoke reinforced the story he'd crafted, the narrative of her guilt and his innocence. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why do all this? David's eyes met hers, and for just a moment, she saw the cold calculation behind the concern. Do what, dear? Try to save our marriage? Try to understand why my wife was sleeping with another man. Try to help the police understand what happened that night. Mrs. Clayton, Rodriguez interrupted gently. We've finished processing the last of the evidence from Mr. Maxwell's apartment. Would you like to explain the emails we found? Jane turned to the detective. Emails? From your personal account to Mr. Maxwell. Discussing your husband's schedule, his habits, particularly his time in the basement. Rodriguez opened a folder. One message specifically mentions how convenient it is that he spends so much time down there. How it would be the perfect place to solve your problem. That's not. I never wrote. Jane's voice failed as Rodriguez placed the printouts in front of her. There they were, in black and white. Emails she'd never sent plotting things she'd never planned. You're under arrest, Mrs. Clayton. Morris's voice seemed to come from far away. For the murder of Samuel Maxwell. As the detective read her rights, Jane stared at David. He watched her with that same patient, sad expression, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. I'll hire the best defense attorney, he promised as they led her away. We'll get through this, dear. Together, the handcuffs felt cold against her wrists, as cold as the basement floor where Sam had died, as cold as David's smile when he thought no one else was looking. They led her past her lawyer's apologetic face, past Rodriguez's pitying glance, past the evidence boards covered in photos and documents that told the story David had written for her. The last thing she saw before they took her away was David, standing in the hallway, his hand raised in a gentle farewell. Behind him, through the station window, she could just make out their house in the distance, and in it, that eternal basement light, still watching, still waiting, marking the spot where David's revenge had begun and her life had ended. The interrogation room glass reflected Jane's face back at her, ghostly and unfamiliar. 3 days in custody had left dark circles under her eyes, stripped away her executive polish. Her designer suit had been replaced by prison orange. Her manicured nails chipped and broken. The door opened, admitting her new lawyer, not Harrison, but Thomas Weber, the defense attorney David had promised. Weber set his briefcase on the table with practiced precision. Mrs. Clayton, he began, his voice smooth as polished stone, I've reviewed your case thoroughly. The evidence is substantial. Jane leaned forward. He planned it all. David orchestrated everything from that basement of his. The emails, the photos, the weapon. Mrs. Clayton, Weber held up a manicured hand. Before we continue, I need you to understand something. I'm not here to prove conspiracy theories. I'm here to keep you off death row. Death row? The words hit like physical blows. They can't. First-degree murder with special circumstances? They absolutely can. Weber opened his briefcase. The prosecution has forensic evidence, digital records, witness statements, and a clear motive. They're painting a picture of a calculating woman who killed her lover to prevent him from exposing their affair. But that's exactly what David wanted. He planted everything, manipulated the evidence. Your husband, Weber cut in, has been nothing but cooperative. He's devastated by your actions but still wants to help. He's mortgaged the house to pay for your defense. Jane laughed, the sound harsh in the sterile room. Of course he did. It's part of his performance. The grieving husband, standing by his murderous wife. Mrs. Clayton, Weber's voice hardened. This attitude isn't helping. The prosecution has evidence that you purchased the murder weapon 2 weeks before the crime. What? That's impossible. He pulled out a document. Security footage from Howard's Hardware. You purchased a set of wrenches, paid cash. The clerk remembers you specifically because you asked about rust resistance. I never. Jane stopped, remembering. David asked me to pick up tools for his basement work. Said his were getting old. And you didn't find that suspicious? Everything was suspicious by then. He was always watching, always planning. She gripped the edge of the table. Check the basement. There must be something. The police have searched the basement thoroughly. They found exactly what your husband said they would. His woodworking projects, including the mahogany table he was refinishing the day of the murder. The blood on his hands would stain. Weber sighed. Mrs. Clayton, you need to understand your position here. The prosecution has physical evidence placing you at the scene. They have emails discussing the murder plan. They have financial records showing large cash withdrawals for the hotel meetings with Sam, which supports their theory that you were planning to flee after the murder. He shuffled through more papers. They also have the testimony of Mr. Maxwell's neighbor, who saw you entering his building with a gym bag the day before his death. The same bag was found in your office, containing traces of blood. Jane's mind raced. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every coincidence had been carefully crafted to tell one story. Her story, written in David's meticulous hand. The door opened again, admitting Detective Rodriguez. Mrs. Clayton, your husband is here. He'd like to speak with you. No. Jane shrank back in her chair. I don't want to see him. It might help your case, Weber suggested. Show remorse, cooperation. Remorse? Jane's voice rose. For what? For being stupid enough to have an affair? For not seeing what David was planning? For walking into every trap he set? Rodriguez's face softened slightly. Mrs. Clayton, your husband has been very understanding. He's arranged for psychiatric evaluation, suggesting that stress and paranoia I might have. Paranoia? Jane stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. Is that what he's saying now? That I'm crazy? Paranoid? Do you want to know what paranoia really is? Try living with someone who watches your every move, who leaves little clues about knowing your secrets, who turns your own basement into a stage for murder. Jane? David's voice came from the doorway, gentle as poison. I heard shouting. He stood there in another perfect suit, his face a mask of concern. Everything about him radiated sincere worry. The slight furrow of his brow, the way he held himself back as if afraid to upset her further. Get out. Jane's voice shook. Get out, you manipulative bastard. I understand you're angry, David said softly. The psychiatrist said this might happen. Projection of guilt, paranoid delusions. Jane lunged forward, only Weber's quick grab at her arm stopping her. Tell them how you followed us, how you planned everything in that basement of yours. The basement. David shook his head sadly. It always comes back to the basement with you. Is that why you killed him there? Some kind of symbolic gesture? I didn't kill him. You did this. You set everything up, planted the evidence, created this whole story. Mrs. Clayton, Rodriguez interrupted. Please sit down. Mrs. Clayton, Rodriguez interrupted. Please sit down. Why can't you see it? Jane turned to the detective. Look at him. Really look. This whole grieving husband act, it's all calculated. Every word, every gesture, every piece of evidence. Jane. David stepped closer, his voice dripping concern. You need help. Real help. The doctors say with proper treatment, you might be able to accept what you've done. What I've done? She laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. What about what you've done? The photos you planted, the emails you faked, the way you pushed Sam to confront me that day. I think, Weber said firmly, we should end this meeting. No. Jane pulled away from his restraining hand. David, look at me. Tell them the truth. Tell them how long you planned this, how carefully you set everything up. Tell them about the basement, about all those hours you spent down there planning my destruction. David's face showed nothing but sadness and pity. Do you hear yourself, Jane? These conspiracy theories, these accusations, this isn't you. The stress of what you've done, the guilt, it's affecting your mind. My mind is perfectly clear, Jane spat. For the first time, I see exactly what you are. What you've always been. A manipulator. A planner. A man who can spend months orchestrating the perfect revenge. David turned to Rodriguez. I should go. The doctor said not to agitate her. He moved toward the door, then paused. I still love you, Jane. Despite everything. We'll get through this together. The words hit her like physical blows. Jane watched him leave, saw the sympathy on Rodriguez's face, the resignation on Weber's. They all believed him. Of course they did. David had written this script months ago, planned every scene, every line, every piece of evidence. Mrs. Clayton, Weber said quietly, I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach. These accusations against your husband, they're not helping your case. Jane sank back into her chair, staring at her reflection in the interrogation room glass. Behind it, she knew David would be watching, savoring every moment of her unraveling. She could almost hear the basement's eternal hum, see its fluorescent light casting shadows over Sam's body, feel the cold concrete against her knees as her perfect life crumbled around her. The trap had closed completely now, every escape route blocked, every defense turned against her. And somewhere, in a basement that had become both crime scene and stage, David's revenge played out exactly as he'd planned. 1 week later, Jane sat across from David in the prison visiting room. She hadn't wanted to come, but Weber insisted something about new evidence that might help her case. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like the basement's eternal hum. You're looking thin, David observed, his voice carrying that same false concern. Are you eating? Stop it. Jane leaned forward, her prison jumpsuit crinkling. Drop the act. No one's watching here. David's eyes flicked to the security camera in the corner. There's always someone watching, Jane. You taught me that. His mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and satisfied underneath. Shall I tell you a story? About how you orchestrated all this? About a man who trusted his wife. David's voice turned contemplative. A man who noticed small changes late nights at work, hidden phones, secret smiles. A man who could have confronted her, could have raged and threatened. But instead he watched, and planned, and waited. Jane's hands clenched under the table. How long? How long were you following us? From the first hotel meeting? David smiled slightly. Room 412. You were careless that day, left a receipt in your coat pocket. After that, well, you'd be amazed what you can learn when you really pay attention. The basement. All those hours down there, my workshop became my thinking space. Every tool in its place. Every plan carefully constructed. He leaned back, perfectly at ease. Did you know Sam had a gambling problem? Made him easy to pressure. A few anonymous calls about his debts. A suggestion that someone knew about the affair. You pushed him to confront me. I merely created the circumstances. You both did exactly what I knew you would do. David's voice carried a teacher's patience. You running to his apartment in a panic. Him, demanding you leave town together. All I had to do was direct the scene. You killed him. Did I? David raised an eyebrow. The evidence suggests otherwise. Your fingerprints on the wrench, remember when I asked you to bring me tools? The bloody clothes in your office planted there after you left for lunch. The emails discussing the basement as a murder site sent from your personal account, which you really should have protected better. Jane felt sick. The divorce papers in his safe. A nice touch, wasn't it? Amazing what people will notarize with the right documentation. The plane tickets were trickier, but worth it for the narrative. He smiled. A desperate woman, planning to flee with her lover, kills him when he threatens to expose everything. You're enjoying this, Jane realized. Telling me how clever you were, how perfectly you planned everything. Wouldn't you? Months of work, every detail orchestrated, every piece of evidence placed just so. David's eyes glittered. The police find exactly what I want them to find. Your lawyer sees exactly what I want him to see. Even your protests about my elaborate plot just make you sound more unhinged. Why not just divorce me? Why all this? Divorce? David's voice hardened for the first time. Let you walk away with half my money, half my life? Let you run off with your lover while I play the forgiving fool. He leaned forward. No, Jane. You needed to understand consequences. Real consequences. So you murdered an innocent man? Sam wasn't innocent. He knew you were married. Knew you were mine. David's calm facade cracked slightly. But you're right about one thing. I did orchestrate everything. Every late night you spent with him, every secret meeting, every lie you told, I watched it all, documented it all, built my case piece by piece while you thought you were so clever, so careful. Jane stared at him, really seeing him for the first time. You're insane. No, I'm methodical. There's a difference. He straightened his already perfect tie. Everything in its place, every tool serving its purpose. Just like in my workshop, they'll find out. Eventually, someone will see through this. Will they? The evidence tells such a compelling story. The unfaithful wife, the secret affair, the plan to escape, the murder in a basement she never visited anymore. David's smile returned. And me, the devastated husband, standing by her despite everything. Mortgaging our house for her defense, suggesting psychiatric help, hoping she'll finally accept what she's done. You rehearsed this, didn't you? This whole conversation. Planned exactly what you'd say, how you'd say it. Of course, just like I planned everything else. He checked his watch, a deliberate gesture, Jane realized, meant to show how little she mattered now. Weber will be here soon. He wants to discuss a plea deal. I won't plead guilty. You will. David's certainty was absolute. Because the alternative is death row. And despite everything, I don't want you dead, Jane. I want you to live, to spend years in a cell, remembering every choice that led you here. Every lie, every secret meeting, every betrayal. Like you're remembering Sam's murder? I remember everything. David stood, smoothing his jacket. Every detail, every plan, every moment of watching you destroy yourself while thinking you were so careful. That's my gift to you, Jane. The knowledge that your own actions made this possible. I just arranged the circumstances. Weber entered as David reached the door. Ah, good timing, David said, his mask of concern slipping perfectly back into place. She's agitated, but that's to be expected. The doctor said these delusions might take time to work through. Jane watched him leave, her hands shaking. Everything he'd said, every confession, every detail of his plan, none of it mattered. He'd known that, known he could tell her everything because no one would believe her. The security camera had caught their conversation, but all it would show was an agitated prisoner and a concerned husband. More evidence of her instability, her paranoid accusations. Mrs. Clayton, Weber began, setting his briefcase on the table. The prosecution has offered a deal. 25 to life, with possibility of parole. Given the evidence, he just confessed. Jane's voice sounded strange in her ears. To everything. Planning it all, killing Sam, planting evidence. Weber's face showed only practiced patience. Mrs. Clayton, these accusations against your husband aren't helping. The prosecution has DNA evidence now from the gym bag. Your DNA mixed with Mr. Maxwell's blood. Because David planted it there. He just told me how he did it, how he planned everything. Stop. Weber's voice hardened. Listen to yourself. Your husband mortgaged your house to pay for your defense. He's arranged psychiatric care, supported you despite everything. These conspiracy theories only hurt your case. Jane slumped in her chair, the fight draining out of her. She could almost hear David's voice. I just arranged the circumstances. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead reminded her of the basement, of Sam's blood soaking into concrete, of David's perfectly orchestrated revenge. She had walked into every trap, played every role he'd written for her, become exactly what he wanted everyone to see. A desperate, unstable woman who killed her lover rather than face exposure. The plea deal, Weber continued, his voice distant. You need to consider it carefully. 25 years is better than death row, Jane finished. I know. David made that very clear. The courtroom fell silent as Jane stood for sentencing. 3 months had passed since her conversation with David in the prison visiting room. 3 months of mounting evidence, failed motions, and Weber's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage her defense. Mrs. Clayton, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. You stand convicted of first-degree murder. Before I pronounce sentence, would you like to make a statement? Jane looked across the courtroom. David sat in the front row, perfectly groomed in a dark suit, his expression a masterpiece of concerned grief. He'd testified yesterday, his performance flawless. I found out about the affair, he'd told the court, his voice catching just enough to seem genuine. I was hurt, angry, but I wanted to work through it. I thought if I gave her space, showed her I could forgive. He'd paused, wiped his eyes. I never imagined she would. Now he watched her with that same practiced concern, knowing she had one last choice to make: accept the plea deal or face the death penalty. One final trap in his perfectly constructed plan. Yes, Your Honor. Jane's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. I'd like to tell the truth. Weber tensed beside her. They discussed this, argued about it. He'd wanted her to express remorse, accept responsibility, play into the narrative of a woman driven to desperation. Instead, she turned to face David directly. My husband is a patient man, she began, methodical. The kind of man who plans everything carefully, who puts every tool in its proper place. The kind of man who can spend months orchestrating the perfect revenge. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. David's expression didn't change. When he discovered my affair, he didn't confront me, didn't rage or threaten. Instead, he watched, planned, created an elaborate performance where everyone would play their parts exactly as he intended. Mrs. Clayton, the judge warned, if you're not going to take responsibility— I am taking responsibility, Jane cut in, for being blind, for not seeing what was happening in that basement of his, for walking into every trap he set, playing every role he wrote for me. She turned back to the judge. My husband killed Sam Maxwell, planned it for months, planted evidence, created the perfect narrative of a desperate woman killing her lover. And when I found Sam's body in the basement, David was ready. Had been ready for months. Every piece of evidence in place, every witness primed, every detail perfect. Your Honor, Weber started to rise, but Jane continued. He told me everything. In the prison visiting room, with cameras running. Explained how he'd planned it all, orchestrated every detail. But he knew no one would believe me. Because he'd already written my role, the unstable wife, spinning conspiracy theories to avoid responsibility. She looked at David again. His mask had slipped slightly, showing a flash of satisfaction before concern returned. The basement was his workshop, you see, where he spent months planning, preparing. Every tool in its place, every piece of evidence carefully arranged. He made me the architect of my own destruction, used my affair as the foundation for his revenge. The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Mrs. Clayton, this court has heard extensive evidence of your guilt. If you cannot show remorse— I am remorseful, Jane interrupted, for trusting a man who could spend months watching his wife's affair, documenting every detail, planning the perfect murder, for not seeing that every late night, every secret meeting, every lie I told was another piece in his puzzle. She turned to the gallery, to the reporters scribbling frantically, to the jurors who had convicted her. Look at him. Really look. See how perfectly he plays the grieving husband. How carefully he maintains that mask of concern. He mortgaged our house for my defense, suggested psychiatric help, stood by me despite everything, all part of his performance. Mrs. Clayton, the judge's patience had run out. You've been convicted by a jury of your peers. The evidence against you is overwhelming. These accusations against your husband are exactly what he knew I would make, Jane finished. The final stroke in his masterpiece. The desperate murderer, spinning tales to avoid punishment. She laughed, the sound harsh in the formal courtroom. He told me himself, every detail planned, every piece of evidence placed just so. He orchestrated everything, knowing that telling me would only make me sound more unhinged. Enough. The judge's voice cut through her words. Mrs. Clayton, you stand convicted of first-degree murder. Your continued denial of responsibility and these unfounded accusations demonstrate a complete lack of remorse. Jane watched David's face as the judge continued. His mask was perfect now, showing just the right mixture of pain and disappointment. But his eyes gleamed with triumph. However, the judge continued, In consideration of your husband's plea for mercy and the prosecution's recommendation, I am sentencing you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The gavel fell with devastating finality. As officers moved to lead her away, Jane looked one last time at David. He stood, straightening his tie with those precise movements she remembered from countless mornings. "I'll visit when I can," he called after her, his voice carrying just the right note of sad devotion. "The doctors say with time and treatment, you might be able to accept what you've done." The doors closed behind her, but not before she heard the murmurs of sympathy from the gallery, saw the looks of pity directed at David. He had orchestrated it perfectly. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every detail leading to this moment that I in her cell that night. Jane stared at the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. It reminded her of the basement, of Sam's blood soaking into concrete, of David's careful hands arranging every piece of his revenge. She could almost hear his voice. "I just arranged the circumstances. You did everything else yourself?" The light hummed on, eternal and accusing, just like the basement light that had watched her destruction. Somewhere in their perfect suburban house, David would be in his workshop, every tool in its place, savoring the completeness of his victory. He had written her story in blood and evidence, turned their basement into both crime scene and a stage, and made her play every role exactly as he'd planned. Her perfect life had become his perfect revenge, orchestrated from a basement that had been both workshop and weapon. And now, in a cell lit by the same fluorescent glare, Jane finally understood the full scope of David's patience, his planning, his absolute dedication to destroying her completely, that he had never meant to kill her. Death would have been too simple, too quick. Instead, he had crafted something far more devastating. A punishment that would last for decades, a truth that no one would ever believe, and a story that would end exactly as he had written it.
Story 4.
Jack, yeah. She thought she was being sneaky, but what she didn't know was that I had learned about all of this from a colleague of hers who was disgusted by what was happening. I made my plans and got ready. Fortunately, I had time to manage the anger and prepare for what was about to unfold. It would all kick off tonight, right after dinner. "Kayla, tonight then?" Mary, my friend, inquired. "Yeah, I'm finally going to do it. I'll wait until after dinner, hand him a beer, and then I'll fill you in on what happens," I replied. "Just remember to stay strong. He won't like it, but you have to remain firm." "I'll keep that in mind, just as we discussed. He doesn't have a choice. This is how it's going to be, and if he truly loves me, he'll let me do this for my happiness." "That's right. Just be prepared for him to yell and scream. He'll resist, but eventually, he'll come to his senses and accept the new reality. It's crucial that you stay calm but firm. Let him have his tantrum, and then he'll realize that you're in charge." "That's right. Besides, as far as he knows, this will only be temporary. Once he accepts it, he'll start to enjoy it. Then, it'll just keep going." "Are you sure about all this? Jack can be very stubborn." "Look, Kayla, Jack loves you more than anything in the world. Sure, he'll get angry, but when he calms down, he'll realize that he loves you so much that he'll do anything to make you happy, even that." "Okay, I think you're the expert. Trust me, it took me messing up 2 marriages to figure it all out, but I perfected the method on my 3rd marriage. You've met my current husband. He is now completely under my control. He even stands next to the bed when I'm with someone else. I also sometimes have him clean up afterward. A month from now, another Jack will get in line as well. Then you can be assured of the security of your marriage to Jack, as well as the pleasure of several other men." I finished the day and went home to cook Jack his favorite dinner. When Jack came home, he greeted me with the words, "I love you," and kissed me on the cheek as usual. Despite my best efforts, I was still nervous. This was going to be a significant step and change in our marriage, but it was all worth it. Mary had been telling me about her feminine marriage ministry for quite some time now. I have personally seen it work for her and her husband. He was really happy with how their marriage turned out. I'm sure Jack would love it too. The conversation over dinner was pleasant. We exchanged stories from the previous day and discussed some of the day's news. It was a laid-back dinner for us. After dinner, I insisted that he grab a beer and relax while I cleaned up. He resisted a bit, wanting to help, but I assured him it wasn't much and I could handle it. The leftovers were stored, the dishes went into the dishwasher, and it was time. I poured myself a glass of wine, mentally prepared, and headed into the living room for the conversation. "Jack, honey, we need to talk," I began. "Sure, honey. About what?" "Okay, Jack, I realize this might be difficult for you to accept right now, but it's something I really need to do. Please keep in mind that this is only temporary, okay? So, what do you need? If it's that crucial to your happiness, of course, I'll do what I can." So far, he had handled it well, not even bothered. That's good. We've discussed having kids, and I'm almost ready for that. But there are a couple of other things I need to do first. It should take a couple of months at most. Then we can start working on having kids. That's great, baby. So what are those things you need to do? Here it is. I took a deep breath, preparing for the reaction. Well, Jack, I need to explore a bit before settling down completely. It will be temporary, and then I can be the best wife and mother to our children you could dream of. All right, my love, that sounds reasonable so far. But how are you planning to go about it? Wow, he's handling it well. I expected him to freak out. I'll be seeing other men for a while. We'll still make love regularly, but I'll also have lovemaking with other guys to clear my head. Remember, it's only lovemaking with them. You are the only one who has my love. I'll return to you in a couple of months, be your faithful wife again, and then we can start working on having the kids we've planned. Well, Kayla, you don't seem to be asking for my permission, so I assume you've made up your mind. I'd like to go on record saying I'm not in favor of it. If you're asking for permission, I'm not giving it. However, you're a grown woman, so I won't stop you if you think it's necessary. Things were going better than I imagined. He didn't raise his voice, said it conversationally. Mary must be right. Jack will accept the new role I'm preparing him for. So, Kayla, how will this work? Are you moving out or do you expect me to? Are you bringing them here or going to their place or a hotel? Oh, well, we're both going to keep living here. We're married, and as I said, we'll keep making love. The other guys will just be lovemaking. With you, it will be making love. I may go to them or bring them here. In those cases, you'll have to sleep in the spare bedroom. I don't see the need for a hotel room since we could just stay here. Again, I'm not in favor, but we shouldn't have lovemaking during this. I won't risk catching any STDs. Once you're done, we'll wait until you're tested and cleared. Have fun. Don't worry about me. Well, Jack, can't say I'm not disappointed. I love you and enjoy our lovemaking. But I understand your concern. I'll just have to live with it. That's great, honey. So when do you plan to start your little flings? Well, Mary and I decided to hit a club and meet a couple of guys from work tomorrow night. I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but I might bring one of them back for the night. Since you're not going to have lovemaking with me while I'm doing it anyway, maybe it would be best if you just move into a spare room for the next couple of months. Okay, Kayla, don't worry about it. I'll take care of moving in by the time you get home tomorrow night, Jack said, before returning to reading the paper. I couldn't believe how mature he was about the whole thing. My heart soared. Sure, he weakly complained and refused lovemaking, but he was completely accepting of everything. He wasn't even the least bit angry. Mary was definitely right. In 2 months, Jack would be under my thumb. Besides, I knew this lack of lovemaking was only temporary. In a week or two, he'd be back in my bed. Then I would just use the vulvanal wrench to get him to fully embrace his new role as my submissive little hubby. Update. Hi, Mary, it's Kayla. Hey, girl, so how'd it go last night? Oh my God, you wouldn't believe how mature Jack was about everything. I expected him to go nuclear, but he didn't even raise his voice. He was just so calm and accepting of it all. Wow, that's great. I told you he'd comply. Do you think you'll be able to convince him to watch tonight? I doubt it. In fact, I don't think I'll even suggest it. He said he'd refuse to have lovemaking with me while I'm with someone else. I'm sure that won't last long. After a week or two of using his hands, knowing he has a beautiful woman by his side, he'll be right back. That could be a lot of fun. Since he refused to touch me, I just went ahead and made him move to the spare room. He's packing his things now. He promised me that he would completely move out of the owner's bedroom before I came home tonight. Ha, I love that you changed the name from master bedroom to owner's bedroom. I'm going to have to start doing that myself. Oh, definitely. Anyway, I should probably get ready. I'll meet you at the club. Okay, bye. Bye. Later that night, Jack had made pretty good progress on boxing up all the stuff from my bedroom. I wasn't sure why he really needed to pack when he could just carry armfuls of stuff down the hall, but he explained that it was better that way. It would be less walking, and he could go through everything and leave the things he really didn't need in boxes to get rid of. I guess that made some sense, but I was too busy getting ready to pay attention. He did say how seductive I looked in my underwear, garter belt, stockings, and 5-inch loafers. He said nothing when I wore the little red cocktail dress I got for our 5th anniversary last year. That was actually the only time I wore it, but I looked damn good in it. I informed Jack that I was going out and expected to return around 1 a.m. I mentioned that he didn't need to wait for me, as I might not be alone. After saying this, I picked up my clutch and prepared to leave. He assured me not to worry, mentioning that he would have moved out by the time I returned. As he made this promise, he closed the last box. As I left the house, a sense of unease lingered within me, though I couldn't quite identify its source. Despite this, I chose to dismiss it, directing my focus towards the anticipated fun and excitement of the night. At the club, I encountered Mary, Larry, and Josh, the account managers known for their attractiveness and reputed endowment, according to Mary and some of the other office girls. While Jack was moderately endowed, the thought of experiencing a considerably larger member intrigued me, with the added expectation that they knew how to use their assets effectively. In the midst of conversation, Mary asked about Jack's move to the spare bedroom when our first order arrived. I confirmed that he had completed packing and assured me of being entirely moved out by the time I returned. Upon sharing this information, Josh questioned if Jack had indeed made such a statement. I affirmed, recalling Jack's words when I mentioned my expected return time. Our group burst into laughter at the remark, and Larry humorously expressed disappointment about Jack having moved out, as he was hoping to involve him in an carnal setting. I playfully suggested that perhaps after some persuasion, we could consider such arrangements. In the midst of the banter, I observed that neither Larry nor Josh had extended an invitation to dance. Over the course of several hours, we engaged in dancing and indulged in drinks. I danced with both of them on multiple occasions, particularly during slow songs, where we embraced closely, feeling their hardnesses against me. Throughout the night, their hands remained on my backside. Later, Mary and I took a break and went to the ladies' room to discuss the conclusion of the night. We decided the outcome of the ride home through 3 rounds of rock, paper, scissors, resulting in me driving Josh and Mary accompanying Larry. Upon arriving at the house, I led Josh through the front door, noticing that it was dark inside. I assumed Jack had retired to bed by then, reassuring myself that everything was in order. Anyway, we didn't need him watching. I led Josh down the hall to my room. Of course, all of Jack's stuff was gone. Maybe I should reward him by offering him a hand job. There would be something to think about later. Right now, I had other things requiring my attention. It didn't take us long to undress, but Josh wanted me to keep the garter belt and stockings on. I'd lost my thong a couple of hours ago, unsure if it was Larry's or Josh's. It didn't matter. I made enough money to buy others. The next 2 hours were sheer bliss. We started with start position, then switched to another one to avoid exhaustion too quickly. We finished that round with cowgirl. After a brief rest, I enjoyed when he spanked my ass while I rode him. Maybe I'll let Jack do it on his birthday or our anniversary, but it wouldn't happen again. I'd save it for my other lovers. We ended up in the shower before going to bed, and again when we woke up the next morning. After that, Josh had to leave for his wife and kids. So I put on my robe and went to get some coffee. I felt a bit let down that Jack hadn't brewed coffee yet, considering it was already past 9 o'clock. Typically, he'd be up for an hour by now. I planned to address it with him later. I mean, would it hurt him to make me coffee and breakfast, especially after I stayed up late? So much for the handiwork I was going to offer him as a reward for moving into the spare bedroom while I was away. After devouring my breakfast bagel, I headed to the shower and got dressed. The warm water did wonders for soothing my sore muscles. Since I had no plans for the day, I opted for my old shorts and a t-shirt. As I was only going to be around Jack, I wore a functional bra and an old pair of regular underwear. Just as I finished tying my hair into a ponytail, the phone rang. "Hey, girlfriend." It was Mary. "Hey, seductive thing. So how was Josh last night? He was amazing. It was exactly as I thought it would be." Speaking of Jack, What was his reaction this morning? I don't know. I'm a little angry because he seems to be asleep. I was disappointed that he didn't make me breakfast and coffee this morning. I was thinking of offering him a part-time job for being moved to the spare room. But now, I don't think so. Yes, make sure he knows how disappointed you are and what you expect from this moment. Continue to be aggressive with him, but make sure you give him small rewards when he does something good. This will give him incentive to try harder. I'm actually starting to get angry that he still hasn't gotten up. Wait a minute while I get his lazy ass out of bed. I walked down the hall to the spare bedroom and pounded on the door, shouting his name. No response. I tried again. Still no answer. Finally, I turned the knob and swung the door open. "Oh, crap," I exclaimed. "What's wrong?" Mary asked on the phone. "Jack isn't in the spare bedroom. His clothes aren't even in the closet." "Wait," I said, running through the house. Crap, his truck is gone, as are all his tools. That little stirring in the back of my head was starting to take shape. "Oh no," I gasped. "What? What is it?" Mary asked. "Jack moved out." Now I understood what he was talking about. He never said he would move his stuff into the spare room. He only said he would move his stuff out of my room. Then he said he would move in before I returned. I thought he meant he would move out of my room, but he meant he would move out of the whole house. Crap. I need to call him and find out where he's gone. No, this is wrong. It sends him a message of weakness. You have to stay strong. Don't contact him. Let him contact you. Trust me, right now he's just having a little tantrum. In a couple of days, he'll come crawling back to you. This is actually a very good thing. Now you have a reason to punish him and make him beg to do something for you to let him come back. It speeds up the process. I bet you could even let Josh or Larry knock you up and make Jack raise the baby. Are you sure about that? I'm sure. Look what my husband does for me. Well, I have to admit, you've been right so far. Of course I am. Oh, and Larry wants to meet you in the supply closet at work for an hour on Monday. Can we really get away with that? Sure. At least half the girls are doing it. It's so bad I have to do it on a schedule. I'll email you the meeting time. Just put it down as an appointment somewhere else. Don't worry about it. The boss never goes there, and everyone who needs something there knows to ask me before going to get something. We continued our conversation for a bit longer before ending the call. I must confess, I felt a bit uneasy about Jack's move. Despite my actions, I genuinely love him and envision spending my life with him. Mary's portrayal of a feminine lifestyle sounded appealing, offering me the opportunity to explore various men. Eventually, I plan to give up other relationships, but Jack will remain my devoted and submissive spouse. Perhaps in a few years, I can negotiate with Jack to let me tie him down in exchange for ceasing involvement with other men. Of course, this will only happen when I'm ready to give it up, and he doesn't need to know that. Yes, I could use binding as a condition for his return. I'd need to consider that. Regardless, I needed to recover from the previous night and brace myself for a demanding day at work tomorrow. I shrugged it off, prepared a simple dinner, enjoyed a glass of wine, and went to bed. Throughout the week, there was no word from Jack. Mary assured me it wasn't entirely unexpected, and predicted he would contact me soon. The longer he stayed away, the more conditions I could establish for his return. This week, I'd been meeting Larry, Josh, and a couple of other attractive guys in the pantry every day, with a double-team session with Larry and Josh scheduled for this afternoon. On Friday morning, during our break around the coffee machine, Larry, Josh, Mary, and I engaged in conversation. Suddenly, a professionally dressed woman approached and inquired if we were Kayla Adams, Mary Morgan, Josh Johnson, and Larry Jones. After introducing ourselves, she handed each of us an envelope and quickly took pictures with a small digital camera. She mentioned that we had all been served and then headed towards our boss's office. I called after her, asking what it was about, and she responded in a sweet southern voice that she was paid to distribute them as a joke, not to read them. She entered the boss's office without knocking. Less than a minute later, she cheerfully left the building, wishing us a good day. Simultaneously, we opened our envelopes, discovering divorce papers citing spousal cheating as the reason. I was frozen in shock. Josh and Larry's phones rang shortly after, their wives having received proof of their infidelity. Their belongings were about to be tossed out, and they were to take turns sleeping. Divorce papers were imminent. Our boss's voice boomed from the office, expressing frustration. he suddenly appeared in the doorway, yelling loudly enough for the entire office to hear. He called for Adams, Morgan, Johnson, and Jones to come into his office immediately. A sense of foreboding settled over me as we walked past him with bowed heads and entered his office, the door slamming behind us. Once inside, he conveyed his discontent, emphasizing that the situation was beyond just bad. He demanded an explanation while waving a manila envelope, but none of us dared to speak. He proceeded to inform us that the company was facing a lawsuit for not adhering to the moral code outlined in our employee handbook. He questioned whether any of us could fathom the reason behind such legal action. Once again, we found ourselves unable to respond. He took it upon himself to explain the situation, stating that the lawsuit revolved around allegations against Mrs. Adams, Mr. Jones, and Mr. Johnson for inappropriate conduct, while Mrs. Jones-Morgan was accused of transforming the storage room into a company brothel. He challenged us to deny these allegations and questioned if any of these incidents occurred during business hours or on company property. With no response from us, he expressed frustration and criticized our actions, stating that the court order prevented him from firing us until the case was settled. He instructed us to leave his office until he figured out how to handle the situation. With our heads down, we left his office and made our way to our room. Following that incident, my job became significantly challenging, but I was grateful to still have employment. Deciding to assess the divorce petition, I discovered its severity, containing images, videos, audio recordings, and even notarized letters. An hour later, a company-wide email arrived from the boss, addressing all employees. Management had become aware that employees had repeatedly planned and executed actions contrary to the moral code of conduct detailed in the employee handbook during work hours and on company property. Considering the likelihood of the problem being more widespread than documented, drastic action was announced. Due to uncertainty about which employees were involved, all employees were required to familiarize themselves with the code of morals in the employee handbook. An online class would be developed over the weekend, and every employee must successfully complete it by the following Friday. Security would conduct spot checks of all secluded areas throughout the day, a measure to be repeated until permanent security cameras were installed for monitoring. Subsequently, the storage room would be locked, and the key held by the security supervisor. Any necessary supplies must be brought in with a security escort. The security supervisor would closely monitor computer use to prevent personal use of company assets. Prohibited activities included scheduling non-work-related meetings with coworkers or others, browsing non-work-related websites, and non-work-related text messaging on company computers. Socializing with coworkers should be confined to the break room. During scheduled breaks and lunch periods, security personnel would roam the building to monitor compliance, and the names of those responsible for the actions would not be disclosed. 2 minutes later, my email exploded with hate mail from coworkers. After work, the other three and I met at a bar across the street. Seated at a small table in the corner, we faced disapproving looks from other coworkers during Friday happy hour. At least we still have work to do, at least for a while. That was very nice of him. Why do you think, Jack? I asked about including that in the court order, and Josh dismissed it, suggesting that Jack wasn't trying to cause minimal damage, but rather intended to inflict more pain. I sought clarification, and Josh explained the reference to alimony. He mentioned that while infidelity was the current reason for the divorce, having a stable job and income could prevent a judge from awarding alimony. He cautioned against the risk of not finding another job if laid off, potentially convincing a sympathetic judge to provide financial assistance. The advice was to stay at the job until the divorce was final. Larry raised a scenario after the divorce, suggesting that if all four of us were laid off, there could be no alimony and no job. Josh responded that in such a case, he would resign on Monday. Larry made a joking comment about being a natural blonde, implying that resigning voluntarily could have legal repercussions. He explained that resigning after filing for divorce might be perceived as an attempt to receive support from the ex-spouse, and it could lead to negative judgments from a judge. The recommended course of action was to hold on to the job and save money. Josh expressed concern about his and my situation, emphasizing that their wives might receive alimony and child support due to having children. He He pondered the challenges they would face if laid off, considering that alimony and child support were determined based on income at the time of the divorce. The situation sounded far from promising. Realizing the potential consequences, I felt the need to talk to Jack and attempt to resolve our issues. Despite wanting to assist my friends, the thought of losing my husband made me reconsider my priorities. In a moment of self-reflection, I questioned my initial intentions and concluded that if I needed to prioritize my marriage over my friendships, I would do whatever it took to save it. I swiftly retrieved my cell phone and encountered a message stating that the number I dialed did not accept calls from my number. Frustrated, I requested Mary's phone, explaining that Jack had blocked my number and I needed to discuss the storm issue with him. After attempting to call him on Mary's phone and receiving the same message, it became evident that he had also blocked her number. When suggested to try Larry's phone, I hesitated, expressing concern about the potential consequences of calling my husband from one of my friend's phones. Acknowledging the difficulty in reaching him by phone, I felt a sense of panic, considering that Jack had likely blocked my home and work phones as well. Realizing that talking on the phone might not be effective, I decided to seek him out in person. The urgency to find him and address the situation face-to-face took precedence over any concerns about societal expectations for women in marriage. Reflecting on the changes in my perspective, I recognized that just that morning, I had entertained thoughts of making Jack beg and grovel to come home. Now, the tables had turned, and I found myself uncertain of the roles we would play in the resolution of our situation. I picked up my phone and started going through my contacts. Sure enough, at least one of his friends knows where I can find him. Spoiler, none of our mutual friends knew anything. Well, that wasn't exactly true. None of the previous mutual friends who remained friends with me knew anything. The numerous mutual friends who now hated me knew enough. Unfortunately, while they had no reservations about letting me know they knew where I could find him, they defiantly refused to reveal that information to me. I was met with laughter when I asked if they'd give him a message from me. I had just dejectedly finished my last call and fourth drink. That's when Josh showed his intelligence. Yes, it was said sarcastically. Maybe it was just my mood or the result of the differences between how a woman thinks and how a man thinks. Perhaps some of you will think that what Josh suggested was really brilliant. Me? I don't think so. Well, Josh began, since our lives are already messed up, why don't we go to Kayla's and spend the whole night as a foursome? We've already been carnal, so we can take advantage of that and have a night of passion. He thought that was sound logic. Maybe to him, but I'd just received a big dose of common sense. Of course, if there's nothing left to lose, there might be something to think about. Personally, I think Jack and I still have a tiny chance. That tiny chance would evaporate faster than a drop of water on the surface of the sun if I took everyone into the house and had a late-night gathering with them. I politely declined and offered to let Mary take them home. I had a husband I was trying to get back. I tried everything to find Jack. On weekends, I drove around motel parking lots for hours looking for his truck. I drove past all his friends' houses at different times to see if his truck was there. I even tried to follow his best friend. When I saw him leaving his house, hoping he would go to where Jack was, it was all in vain. Monday morning, I camped across the street from his work. Everyone came in, but Jack never showed up. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Even though I was already late for work. I didn't care. Screw it. They weren't going to fire me right now anyway, and I'd still get fired after the settlement, but that didn't matter. I got out of the car and headed for the office. I saw that the door to Jack's office was closed, so I asked the receptionist. If Jack was here, she told me he was gone for 2 weeks. Crap. The boss threw me an angry look when I walked in 2 hours late. I didn't care. All the phones I could have used are blocked. His friends refused to help. I can't even get a message to him at work. I have no idea where he is, so I can't show up on his doorstep. Mail is not an option because I have no idea where to send it. What are my options? Email. He always checks email. I just have to hope he doesn't block my emails. No problem with attempting, Jack. No excuses. Won't waste time trying to provide one. I've contracted the fool's disease. My decision, not blaming Mary. It was wonderful hearing her talk about women's marriage. No idea why I thought there was a chance you'd accept. Should have known better. Sorry for needing a wake-up call, but now I'm awake. I want you to know I'm deeply embarrassed and regret my actions. I understand you may not accept it. Jack, despite my recent actions, I truly love you completely. You did nothing wrong. It was me being an incredible idiot and selfish. Jack, my love, even though I don't deserve it, I beg you to forgive me. I need to come back, and I'm willing to give you anything. I realized the foolishness of trying to create FELM, but I'd be thrilled to be part of MLF. Yes, Jack, I'm giving you my soul, and you're just giving me orders. I'll literally do anything to get back to where I belong, with you. I know the definition of anything. Please, Jack, I'm offering you anything. Despite no interest in women, I'd do things for you. Serve you and friends at a Super Bowl party in only a garter belt, stockings, and high heels, if it brings me back to you. If you want me in a certain way, tell me to bend over the nearest chair, regardless of who's watching. Spank my spine cheeks with a leather belt. Tell me when and where. I'll bring the belt. No reason to trust me, but I'll put on a chastity belt and give you the keys as a condition for my return. Had blood drawn for an STD test, results in a couple of days. Tell me where to send them and I'll get them to you. Jack, no matter what happens, you're the best person I've known. I know you'd never intentionally hurt me, even though I probably deserve it. I accept it all, not asking you to forget or trust me again. I'm asking for the opportunity to be yours in any capacity you desire. I ask for nothing more than to come back to you forever. Even if I have to agree to a divorce or watch you with other women, I pray it doesn't happen, but I realize it's not my decision. I'm at fault, and I recognize you might want to even the score. Goosey, all that stuff. What about Mary, Larry, Josh, and the lawsuit against my company? Mary manipulated me into agreeing to this plan. Josh and Larry took advantage of that. As you know, I'll be fired once the lawsuit is settled. It's all our fault. Do what you want with them. I'll help if you want. After all, I'm your willing slave from now on. Your loving slave, Kayla. Update. Fortunately, Jack hasn't blocked my email yet. Even more surprising is that he actually read it. No, he didn't take my word for it. After all, I'd already broken the biggest vow I'd ever made, the one about leaving everyone else behind. Since I'd broken that promise, what could make him think I wouldn't break any other promises? All I could do was prove it to him, one action at a time. 2 years had passed since I sent that letter. Josh and Larry faced challenges in their divorces, and all 4 of us were terminated the day after the lawsuit against the company was settled. Eventually, Josh and Larry found lower-paying jobs and moved into a small apartment in a rough neighborhood. Their social lives suffered, and their ex-wives turned the kids against them. I realized both women are now in better relationships. Now it's my turn. Currently, I'm kneeling undressed beside the bed, wearing a chastity belt while Jack finishes. This is my penance. I detailed all of this in a letter. Yes, Jack wanted to test me to see if I would honor those words. If I want him back, I don't have much choice. It was a tough 6 months, but eventually, he eased up a bit. He still makes me do it sometimes, like now, but it's improved. Now, he only brings other women home once every 2 months. After getting fired, I stopped working. Jack got a promotion, and we managed just fine without my income. I stay home, taking care of our 2-year-old twins. I'm undressed most of the time, though Jack recently said I need to start wearing clothes at home soon. The kids are getting old enough that it feels weird otherwise. Right now, I only wear clothes when leaving the house or when we have guests. I still answer the door undressed for deliveries. I underwent laser hair removal, so I have a permanent landing strip over my genitals. This makes it impossible to hide my Jack tattoo on the right side of the band and Jack tattoo on the left side. Every week, Jack updates the 5 red stripes on my buttocks with a leather strap. Right after the 5th stroke, he removes my plug and engages me back fully as I lean over the couch. I'm not perfect. Sometimes there are more stripes on my buttocks or chest when I mess up, but I genuinely enjoy it. Who knew the sting of a strap-on could cause a bond? Mary. Well, she's still married. True, she got fired as well, but no one anticipated her facing any significant consequences. Her husband seemed entirely submissive to her whims. She'd easily find another job, and life would continue for her. Life isn't always fair, right? Actually, it is. Harold wasn't the submissive loser everyone believed. Once he gathered evidence, he got furious. I thought I had a tough 6 months, but compared to hers, it was a walk in the park. Deciding he had punished her adequately, he served her with divorce papers. While putting Mary through hell, he quietly liquidated all their assets and safeguarded them. He gave her the house after refinancing it and taking all the equity, then vanished. She lost the house, and all the money disappeared. She found another job, but for half the salary she used to earn. She also has a tarnished reputation, but is not dating presently, with another month of antibiotics ahead. You might be wondering why I endure this, or laughing at my deserved fate. If you're upset because Jack didn't leave me stranded, I thank God every day he didn't, though I deserved it. I endure it because I can't fathom being without the love of my life. Yes, Jack whips and humiliates me, but he still loves me. He has other women, but never without me. I can leave any time, and Jack showed me divorce papers where he'd be fair. I declined the offer. He's an excellent father, lover, and husband. I don't need anything else. I got so caught up in the idea of women's marriage that I lost sight of what truly matters. Instead of being content in an equal relationship, I became subservient to my husband. It wasn't intended, but I'm content.